Elizabeth Carter fell to her knees in the dust outside the last respectable house in Virginia, begging a housekeeper who wouldn't meet her eyes. Every door in the county had already closed against her. Every name that once respected her father now spat it back like poison. She had nothing left. No home, no family, no future. Then a black carriage stopped on the road behind her, and the man the whole county feared stepped down without a single word. Welcome back. If this is your first time here, subscribe, and stay until the very end, because this story only grows more painful before it heals. Comment the city you're watching from tonight, so I can see how far this story has traveled. The housekeeper did not open the door all the way. She held it at the width of her own shoulder, as if Elizabeth Carter might rush the threshold like a thief, and she looked at the letter in Elizabeth's hand, the way a woman looks at something that might bite her. Mrs. Ashford is not receiving. I only need a moment, Elizabeth said. I have references. I can read. I can keep accounts. I can teach children their letters. Mrs. Ashford is not receiving, the woman said again, slower this time, as if Elizabeth were simple rather than desperate. Please, I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for work. The housekeeper's eyes dropped to the letter, and Elizabeth watched the exact moment the woman's face changed. It was the name at the top. It was always the name at the top. Carter, the housekeeper said, and the word came out of her mouth like something spoiled. You're the Carter girl. My father was innocent. That's not for me to say, miss. He never touched that money. He died still saying so. That's not for me to say, the housekeeper repeated, and she said it to the door as she was already closing it, so that the last of her voice came through a gap no wider than a hand. The door shut. Elizabeth stood on the step, with her letter still raised, as though if she held it up long enough, someone might come back and read it properly this time. Nobody came back. Somewhere behind that door, there would be a warm kitchen, a full pantry, a family sitting down to supper without wondering where tomorrow's bread was coming from, and none of it would ever be opened to her again. She had been to 11 houses since sunrise. She had stopped counting the ones before that. She walked down from the step, her travel bag heavier than it had been that morning, though she'd added nothing to it, and she stood at the end of the drive looking back at the Ashford house. White columns, black shutters, a garden. Someone paid to keep beautiful, and she thought of her father's hands. Not his face. She had trouble holding on to his face some days now. But his hands, she remembered clearly the ink stains on the second and third fingers of his right hand, the way he'd rub his thumb along his jaw when he was working through a difficult letter of the law. Elizabeth. He'd told her the last time she saw him with any strength left in him. A man's name is the only inheritance that costs him nothing to keep clean and everything to lose. Promise me you won't let them take it from you, even after they've taken everything else. She had promised. She hadn't understood at 17 what a promise like that would cost. Now she was 24, and she understood it in the marrow of her bones because the name Carter did not open doors in Virginia anymore. It closed them. It had closed the door of her own house first, when the creditors came with the sheriff's letter. It had closed the door of the church where women who had once invited her mother to tea now looked past her as if she were a smear on a clean window. It had closed 11 doors today, and there was exactly $1.40 left in the bottom of her bag. And the sun was beginning its long slide toward evening, and she did not know where she would sleep. She started walking because there was nothing else to do with her legs. The road out of the Ashford estate ran along a split-rail fence for half a mile before it bent toward the crossroads, and Elizabeth walked it with her chin up, because that was the other thing her father had taught her. You do not let them see you break in the open, only in private, only where it costs you nothing but your own tears. She made it almost to the crossroads before her body betrayed her. Her knees simply stopped agreeing to hold her weight. She caught herself on the fence rail, her palms scraping against the wood, and she stood there a moment, with her forehead nearly touching her own knuckles, breathing hard, willing herself not to weep in the middle of a public road where anyone might see the Carter girl finally come apart. You've had nothing to eat today, she said out loud to herself, because sometimes the only voice of reason left to her was her own. That's all this is. Hunger. Not despair. Hunger. It was both, and she knew it. And she straightened up anyway, and kept walking, because a woman who sat down on the side of the road in Virginia with nowhere to go was a woman who invited exactly the kind of attention Elizabeth could not afford. She heard the carriage before she saw it. The particular heavy rhythm of a good team pulling good leather over a dry road, not the rattling clatter of a farm cart. She stepped instinctively to the side, eyes down the posture she had learned in the last 4 months of walking Virginia roads, asking for work. Make yourself small. Make yourself no trouble. Let them pass. The carriage didn't pass. It slowed. Then it stopped not 10 feet ahead of her, and she heard the driver murmur something low to the horses, and her whole body went tight with the old familiar dread, because a stopped carriage on an empty road for a woman alone was rarely good news. She looked up only because it seemed more dangerous not to. A man was already stepping down. Tall, dark-coated despite the summer heat, his hat low enough that she couldn't see much of his face at first, beyond a hard jaw and the kind of stillness that made her think absurdly of a held breath. He didn't approach her quickly. He didn't approach her the way men sometimes did, with that particular hunger in their step that made her hand go to the small knife she kept in her boot. He simply stood beside the carriage door and looked at her the way a man looks at a fact he is still working out the meaning of. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was low, rough at the edges, a voice that didn't get much use. "You're a fair piece from anywhere on foot." "I'm managing, sir." She straightened, wiped her palm discreetly against her skirt where the fence had scraped it. "Thank you for your concern." Wasn't concern exactly. He tipped his hat back a half-inch, and she got her first proper look at his face, weathered around the eyes in a way that made his age hard to place. 35, maybe older, a scar through one eyebrow that hadn't quite grown hair back over. "Concerns for strangers. I know who you are, Miss Carter." Her stomach dropped straight through the road. "Then you know," she said, and her voice came out sharper than she intended, sharpened by exhaustion and 11 closed doors. "Exactly why I have no business talking with a gentleman on an open road, and why you have no business stopping your carriage for me. Reckon that's my business to decide, not yours. Everyone in this county seems to think my business is theirs to decide." Something moved behind his eyes, not quite a smile, nothing so warm as that, but a flicker of something that might have been respect, or might have been recognition of a temper he understood. "Fair enough," he said. "I'll say my piece, and you can send me on my way if you like. I'm Nathaniel Whitmore." The name landed on her like a stone. Everyone in the county knew that name. The Whitmore estate was the largest holding for 30 miles cattle and tobacco both, and its owner was spoken of in the particular hushed tone people reserved for men they didn't understand, and therefore feared a little. The silent gentleman, some called him, not unkindly, but not warmly either. He did not attend church suppers. He did not call on families with marriageable daughters, though half the mothers in the county would have handed him one gladly, land and silence and all. He simply worked his land, paid his men fair, and said almost nothing to anybody. "I know the name," Elizabeth said carefully. "Figured you might." He studied her a moment longer. "You've been walking this road asking work of every house that'll open a door to you, and every house is closing it." "How would you know that?" "Virginia's a small place when it wants to be, Miss Carter. Word travels faster than a woman on foot." He gestured, not quite toward the carriage, more a general motion that seemed to encompass the whole conversation. "I've got a position open at my estate. Housekeeping, mostly accounts correspondence, some tutoring for the Hensley boy who does chores for me and can't read past his own name. Pays fair, room and board besides." Elizabeth felt the small, dangerous flare of hope she'd learned to be suspicious of, because hope that flared too fast usually burned something on its way out. "Mr. Whitmore, forgive me, but I have to ask outright why you don't know me. You know only what everyone else knows, which is a name attached to a scandal, and most men in your position wouldn't risk their own reputation on a woman the whole county's decided is tainted by it." "Wasn't asking you to trust my reasons," he said. "Just asking if you want the work." "I'd be a fool not to want it. That's not the same as understanding why it's being offered." For a long moment he didn't answer. The horses shifted in their traces, a fly circling one's ear, and somewhere off toward the tree line, a mockingbird ran through half a dozen other birds' songs before settling on its own. Nathaniel Whitmore reached into his coat and drew out a folded letter, worn soft at the creases, as though it had been folded and unfolded a great many times, and he held it out to her without another word. She took it because there was nothing else to do with an offered hand. She unfolded it. It was old paper, the ink gone brown with years, and there were only 3 words written on it in a careful legal hand she recognized instantly because she had grown up watching that same hand write out briefs and letters and her own school lessons at the kitchen table. "I remember your father." Her throat closed. "This is his hand." "It is. Where did you—" She looked up at him and found him watching her with an expression she couldn't read, guarded the way a man guards something that costs him to look at directly. "Mr. Whitmore, where did this come from?" "10 years back," he said. "Your father did me a kindness most men in this county wouldn't have troubled themselves with. I never got the chance to return it before." He stopped himself jaw working once and started again on steadier ground. "Before the trial, before everything that came after." "You knew about the trial." "I was at the trial, Miss Carter." The road seemed to tilt very slightly under her feet. "I don't remember you." "No reason you would. I sat in the back. I wasn't permitted to speak on your father's behalf. Blackwood's lawyers saw to that. Quick enough called me an unreliable witness on account of a land dispute I'd had with one of the jurors years before, which was true enough, though it had nothing to do with your father's honesty." His voice had gone flatter, harder, the way a man's voice goes when he is holding something back by main force. "I've had 10 years to think on what I might have done different. I don't have an answer that satisfies me. What I have is a position open at my estate, and a debt I never got to pay, and a woman standing on the side of a road with a bag in her hand and nowhere left to go." Elizabeth stood very still, the letter trembling slightly in her fingers, though whether from her own hands or some tremor in the air, she couldn't have said. "You're not offering me charity," she said slowly. "You're offering me penance. Call it what you like. I'm still offering it. And if I say no, then I'll drive on and you'll never see me again, and I'll have tried, which is more than I managed 10 years ago." He said it without heat, without any attempt to persuade her further, and somehow that the absence of pressure, the plain willingness to be refused, was what finally cracked something loose in her chest. She had been refused 11 times that day. She had not once in 4 months of walking Virginia roads been offered anything without a price attached that wasn't spoken. But was there all the same in the way certain men's eyes lingered, in the way certain women's questions circled toward things that weren't their business? This offer had a price his own reputation apparently risked on her behalf, but it wasn't a price she was being asked to pay. "Why didn't you come to us?" she asked. "In the 10 years since, if you carried this the whole time." Something in his face closed briefly like a door swinging shut and catching itself before the latch. "Your mother didn't want to see me. Made that clear enough, and I didn't blame her for it. A man who fails you once you've got no reason to trust him showing up a second time with better intentions and no better proof." He looked away down the empty road, and for a moment the stillness in him seemed less like calm and more like something worn into place by long practice, the way water wears a groove into stone. "I heard about your mother's passing. I'm sorry for it. Didn't feel it was my place to come to the burying." Elizabeth had not expected grief to rise up in her throat at that moment, standing on a dusty road with a stranger who wasn't quite a stranger, but it did sudden and sharp, and she had to look down at the letter in her hands to keep her composure. "I don't know how to accept help from a man I don't know," she said finally, "on the strength of a promise made 10 years ago that I never even knew existed. Then don't accept it on the strength of the promise." Nathaniel Whitmore's voice had gone quieter, and something in it made her look up again. "Accept it on the strength of the work needing done, and you needing the work. Everything else you can decide about me on your own time, once you've had cause to watch how I treat the people under my roof. I won't ask you to trust my word for it. It was, Elizabeth thought, the strangest offer of employment she had ever received, and also the first honest one. $1.40, she said, half to herself. Ma'am, that's what I have left in the world, Mr. Whitmore. $1.40 and a bag with 2 dresses and my father's watch, which I haven't sold only because I couldn't bear to. She met his eyes squarely, because whatever else was true, she was still her father's daughter, and her father's daughter did not accept charity without looking a man in the eye first. If I come with you, I come as an employee, not a project for your conscience, not a debt you're settling to sleep easier at night. An employee doing honest work for honest wages, same as any other woman you might have hired. Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but close enough to its country that she noted it. That's the arrangement I'm offering. Then I accept. He nodded once, as if the matter were now closed and required no further ceremony, and he stepped back to open the carriage door for her. Elizabeth hesitated only a moment before she climbed in her bag, clutched against her knees, and as the carriage lurched forward and the Ashford estate fell away behind them, she found herself still holding her father's own handwriting against her chest, like something that might keep her heart beating. Yet, the drive to Whitmore Land took the better part of an hour, and Nathaniel Whitmore said almost nothing during it, which suited Elizabeth well enough, since her own mind was too crowded for conversation. She watched the country roll past good land, well-tended fences, fields that spoke of a man who understood the difference between land that was worked and land that was merely owned. And she found herself, despite everything, cataloging it the way her father had taught her to catalog any situation before deciding how to act inside it. "You don't talk much," she said eventually, because the silence had gone on long enough that she needed to test its edges. "No, ma'am." "Is that a policy or a preference?" "Bit of both, I expect." He didn't look at her when he spoke, kept his eyes on the road ahead. "Talking's got a way of being used against a man in this county. Learned that at your father's trial, watching every word I said get twisted into something I never meant. Easier to keep my mouth shut and let my actions speak where nobody can twist a fence post or a full granary into something it isn't." "That sounds like a lonely way to live." "Reckon it is." He said it plainly, without self-pity, the way a man states a fact about the weather. "Been lonely a long while now. Didn't used to think much on it till lately." She wanted to ask what had changed lately, but something in his tone told her the question would close a door, rather than open one, so she let it be, and watched the fields instead. They arrived as the light was going gold and long across the land, and the house that came into view was not what Elizabeth had expected. Not the ostentatious columned grandeur of the Ashford place, but something sturdier, older, built for use rather than display, with a wide porch and windows that stood open to let the evening air through. A woman came out onto the porch as the carriage drew up, wiping her hands on an apron, gray hair pulled back tight, and her face when she saw Elizabeth stepping down went through several expressions in quick succession: surprise, calculation, and finally something that settled into cautious welcome. "Mrs. Doyle," Nathaniel said, "this is Miss Elizabeth Carter. She'll be keeping the accounts and the correspondence and helping young Hensley with his letters. See, she's settled in the East Room." Mrs. Doyle's eyes flicked to Nathaniel, then back to Elizabeth, and something passed between the housekeeper and her employer that Elizabeth couldn't read, not disapproval exactly, but a kind of watchfulness, as if Mrs. Doyle had seen enough of this man's silences to know that this one meant something particular. "Carter," Mrs. Doyle repeated, testing the name the way every housekeeper that day had tested it, but her face didn't close the way the others had. "The lawyer's girl." "Yes, ma'am. I remember your father," Mrs. Doyle said, and it was said so simply, so without the theater of judgment Elizabeth had braced herself for all day, that she nearly wept right there on the porch steps. "Good man. Never did believe a word of what they said about him, and I told my sister as much at the time for all the good it did." She turned briskly toward the door, the moment closing itself over with the practicality of a woman who had run this household a long time. "Well, come in then, girl, before the mosquitoes get the better of you. You look like you haven't eaten a proper meal in a week." "Or closer to 2 days," Elizabeth admitted. Mrs. Doyle made a sound of disgust at the world in general and ushered her inside, already calling back over her shoulder toward the kitchen, and Elizabeth, following her through the door, glanced back once at Nathaniel Whitmore, who stood by the carriage watching her go, with an expression she still couldn't read, but that no longer frightened her the way a stranger's unreadable expression ought to. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "Wait and see if you still mean it in a month." The kitchen at Whitmore House was warm and full of the smell of bread, and Mrs. Doyle set a plate in front of Elizabeth with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had fed a great many hungry people in her time, and considered arguing with a hungry person a waste of both their energies. "Eat first, talk after," she said, and busied herself at the stove, while Elizabeth did exactly that, the first real meal she'd had in 2 days, disappearing faster than manners strictly allowed. When the worst of the hunger had been blunted, Elizabeth set down her fork and studied the housekeeper's back. "Mrs. Doyle, may I ask you something?" "You may ask. No promise I'll answer." "Mr. Whitmore? Is he always so—" She searched for the word closed. Mrs. Doyle turned from the stove, wiping her hands, and considered the question with the seriousness of someone deciding how much truth a stranger had earned. "He wasn't always," she said finally. "Knew him as a younger man before his father died and left him all this. Talked plenty then. Laughed even, which you'd not credit to look at him now." She sat down across the table, lowering her voice slightly, though there was no one else in the kitchen to hear. "There was a woman once, Miss Caroline Ashworth from over Fredericksburg way. Engaged to be married, the both of them, before her family broke it off on account of some business dealings gone sour between the two families. She married another within the year. Man's barely spoken more than he had to since. That was a long time ago. 12 years near enough. Same year, come to think that your father took up his practice in earnest." Mrs. Doyle's eyes sharpened slightly. "Man's had a hard decade is what I'm telling you, one way and another. Lost the woman he meant to marry, lost the one friend in this county who ever stood up for what was right, regardless of what it cost him, and buried both his parents inside 3 years of each other. A man carries all that he learns to carry it quiet, or it breaks him open in front of people who'd only use the breaking against him." Elizabeth thought of the letter still folded in her bag, 3 words in her father's hand, and something in her chest ached with a tenderness she hadn't expected to feel for a man she'd known less than 3 hours. "He said he tried to testify at my father's trial. He did try. County wouldn't hear it. Blackwood's people made sure of that, dug up some old land quarrel to paint him unreliable, which was a lie built on half a truth, same as most of Blackwood's lies are." Mrs. Doyle's mouth thinned. "That man has had his hand in every piece of trouble in this county for 20 years, and never once been made to answer for a bit of it. Thomas Blackwood." Elizabeth said the name, and felt it sit ugly in her mouth. "He's the one who brought the accusation against my father." "He is." Mrs. Doyle studied her a moment. "You didn't know that before tonight. I knew his name. I knew he was the one who first claimed the funds were missing. I didn't know." She stopped working through the implications slowly, the way her father had taught her to work through a difficult brief one fact set carefully against another until the shape of the whole thing became visible. "I didn't know Mr. Whitmore had any connection to it at all beyond being a man of standing in the county. There's a great deal in this county nobody talks about above a whisper," Mrs. Doyle said, rising to clear the plate, her tone closing the subject, the way a door closes on a room grown too full of draft. "You'll learn what you need to learn in time, same as everybody does. For tonight you need a bed and a wash, and about 11 hours of sleep, unless I miss my guess." She did not miss her guess. Elizabeth shone to a small clean room at the east end of the house with a real bed and a real wash basin and a window that looked out over dark fields toward a horizon. She couldn't yet read. Lay down that night for the first time in 4 months, without the particular fear that had accompanied every previous night, the fear of where tomorrow's roof would come from, and found sleep taking her almost before she'd finished the thought. She woke at first light to the sound of voices raised outside, and years of living on the edge of disaster had trained her body to come fully alert at the first note of trouble in a voice, so she was at the window before she'd properly finished waking, looking down at the yard below. A boy. 13. Perhaps 14. Thin in the way boys get when there isn't quite enough at home to fill them out properly, stood by the fence with his hat crushed in both hands, and Nathaniel Whitmore stood across from him, and though Elizabeth couldn't hear the words, at first she could read the shape of the conversation in the boy's posture, the particular hunched apology of someone bracing for a blow that hadn't landed yet. She dressed quickly and went down, some instinct telling her this was the kind of moment Mrs. Doyle's stories had only sketched the outline of, and she arrived at the kitchen door in time to hear the tail end of it through the open window. "Wasn't stealing, sir, I swear it. My mother's been sick 3 weeks now, and there weren't nothing in the house, and I didn't know who else to ask. And I know I ought to have asked, instead of taking, only I was ashamed to. Hensley." The boy stopped talking. Elizabeth, watching through the window, saw Nathaniel Whitmore crouch down slightly, bringing himself level with the boy's downcast eyes, and his voice, when he spoke again, had none of the flatness she'd heard on the road the day before. "You took a sack of flour and half a side of bacon from my smokehouse without asking. That the truth of it?" "Yes, sir." "And your mother's been sick 3 weeks and there's nothing in your own house to feed her or your sisters?" "Yes, sir." The boy's voice cracked on the second word. "Next time," Nathaniel said, and Elizabeth watched the boy's whole body flinch, bracing for whatever came after that word. "You come to the front door, and you ask me plain, same as any man would. You don't sneak round back of my smokehouse in the dark, like you've got something to be ashamed of because you haven't. A boy taking care of a sick mother's got nothing to be ashamed of in this world. You understand me?" The boy looked up, disbelief plain on his face. "You ain't going to—" "I'm not going to do a blessed thing except send you home with a full sack, this time properly given instead of stolen, and I expect to see you here Monday morning, same as always, for your chores, and we won't speak of this again unless you make a habit of sneaking instead of asking. That clear?" "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir." The boy's voice had gone thick, and he scrubbed at his face with the back of one wrist before jamming his crushed hat back onto his head. "I won't forget this, Mr. Whitmore. Go on home now. Your mother needs that flour more than you need to stand here thanking me." The boy ran the particular full-out sprint of someone whose feet had suddenly remembered how to be young, and Nathaniel Whitmore watched him go with an expression Elizabeth could see clearly now from her angle at the window. Something unguarded, something that looked almost like the ghost of the man Mrs. Doyle had described, the one who used to laugh. Then he turned and saw her standing at the kitchen door, and the unguarded look folded itself away so fast she might have imagined it. "Miss Carter," he said, "didn't mean to wake you." "You didn't." She stepped out onto the porch, unsure quite how to say what she wanted to say, and settling finally on the plainest version of it. "That was a kind thing you just did." "Wasn't kindness. Boy needed flour. I've got flour to spare. Arithmetic is all. Mr. Whitmore." She crossed her arms, and something in her exhaustion from the previous day had burned away overnight, leaving behind a clearer, steadier version of herself, the version her father would have recognized. "I watched you crouch down so a frightened boy wouldn't have to look up at you to be forgiven. That's not arithmetic. Arithmetic doesn't account for a man's pride." He didn't answer that directly. He looked at her for a long moment, and something passed behind his eyes that she was beginning to recognize as the particular effort it cost him to let anyone see past the flat surface he kept turned toward the world. "You're an observant woman, Miss Carter." "My father was a lawyer. I grew up watching him read people for a living. Some habits don't leave a person just because their circumstances have." "No," he said slowly. "I don't expect they do." He looked toward the road the boy had run down, empty now, but for a rising thread of dust settling back into stillness. "There's a fair number of families in this county get by on less than they ought to, and less charity than they need on account of pride running thick in these hills, same as anywhere else. I do what I can, quiet as I can, because a man given help in front of witnesses is a man made small by it, and I'll not be the cause of that for anybody, not after—" He stopped himself again, that same abrupt closing over she'd noticed the day before. "Not after what happened to my father," Elizabeth finished for him gently. "You watched a whole county make him small in public before they destroyed him. You don't want to be party to that ever again for anyone." He looked at her then, with something that might have been surprise, or might have been the particular relief of being understood without having to spend the words on it himself. "You read people well, Miss Carter." "I told you, it's a habit. Best get to breakfast," he said, some of the shutters coming back down over his face, though not all the way this time, not quite. Mrs. Doyle doesn't take kindly to cold biscuits going to waste on account of conversation. The days that followed fell into a rhythm Elizabeth hadn't known she was starving for until she had it ledgers to balance in the small office off the main hall. Correspondence to answer in a hand her father had drilled into her since childhood. An hour each afternoon with young Hensley, who turned out to have a sharp mind buried under a great deal of shame about how slowly he'd learned his letters. Shame that eased visibly once he understood Elizabeth wasn't going to make him feel foolish for needing the lessons. She watched Nathaniel Whitmore in that first week, the way she'd watched every situation her whole life, carefully, patiently building her understanding, fact by fact, rather than accepting the county's verdict wholesale. She watched him settle a dispute between two tenant families over a boundary fence without raising his voice, once listening to both sides fully before rendering a decision so plainly fair that neither family left aggrieved. She watched him turn away, without a word of explanation, 3 separate mothers in the county who arrived with marriageable daughters and transparent excuses for calling. She watched him sit alone on the porch some evenings with a ledger. He wasn't reading, his eyes fixed on the middle distance, and she came to understand that this was not a man without feeling, as the county believed, but a man who had learned at great cost that feeling shown was feeling used against him. It was on the 9th evening that the first real crack in his silence appeared. She'd stayed late in the office finishing a correspondence that had proven more tangled than expected, a dispute over a shipment of tobacco numbers that didn't reconcile no matter how she added them, and she found Nathaniel in the study when she went to report it, a bottle of brandy on the desk in front of him, mostly untouched, and an old newspaper spread open beneath his hands. She recognized the paper before she was close enough to read the headline. She recognized it by the particular way her stomach dropped, the old familiar vertigo of seeing her father's name in print, attached to words like embezzlement and disgrace and guilty. "Mr. Whitmore." He looked up, and there was something raw in his face that he didn't manage to close over fast enough. Something that told her he'd been sitting with that newspaper a long while before she interrupted him. "Forgive me," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "Didn't hear you come in." "You still read about it," she said quietly. 10 years on, some nights. He didn't try to hide the paper, which she took correctly as a kind of honesty. "Some nights I take it out, and I read every line of testimony again, trying to find the place where I might have said something different, done something different, that would have turned the jury the other way. Never find it. 10 years, and I've never once found it." "You can't rewrite a trial by staring at the transcript, Mr. Whitmore." "No," he agreed. "But a man keeps looking anyhow because the alternative's admitting there was nothing to be done, and that's a harder thing to live with than the looking." Elizabeth came further into the room and sat without being asked in the chair across from his desk, and something in the informality of it seemed to loosen something further in him because he didn't object. "Tell me what happened," she said. "The real account of it. Not what the newspapers printed, not what the county believes. What you saw." He was quiet a long moment, his thumb moving along the edge of the newspaper, the way she realized, with a small shock, her own father's thumb used to move along his jaw when working through something difficult. Perhaps it was simply a habit men fell into, working through hard things with their hands as much as their minds. "Your father managed the county relief fund," he said finally. "Had for 6 years, honest as any man ever managed money, and every family in this county that ever needed a hard winter's help knew it. Blackwood sat on the same committee, handled the larger contracts, grain purchases, that sort of thing." His jaw tightened. There was a shortfall discovered near $800, right around the time Blackwood was in some trouble of his own. Debts from a bad shipping venture nobody knew about yet. Your father found the discrepancy himself before anyone else did and went straight to the committee with it, because that was the kind of man he was. Found a problem, reported it himself, rather than let it sit. And Blackwood turned it back on him. Made it look like your father found the shortfall because he'd caused it and got frightened of being caught, rather than because he was doing his job honestly. Nathaniel's hand closed into a fist on the desk, slow, and controlled the anger of a man who had practiced containing it for a very long time. I'd done business with Blackwood myself years before. Knew things about his debts that never made it into any official record because men like Blackwood are careful men. I went to the trial meaning to testify to what I knew of his financial trouble, meaning to give the jury a reason to look elsewhere for their thief. Blackwood's lawyer stood up before I'd said 3 words and reminded the court of an old boundary dispute between me and one of the seated jurors, painted me as a man with a grudge, unreliable, not to be trusted. Judge struck my testimony before I'd given a quarter of it. And my father was convicted on the strength of a man's lies, while the one witness who might have proven otherwise was silenced before he could speak. That's the truth of it, yes. Elizabeth sat with that a long moment, feeling something in her chest that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but some third thing made of both, hardened into something with an edge to it. Why has no one ever looked into Blackwood's debts since, if you knew of them, then surely there's a record somewhere? There was. Something shifted in Nathaniel's face, a carefulness that hadn't been there a moment before. There was a ledger kept by the shipping company he'd borrowed from out of Richmond that showed the full extent of what he owed and when. I saw it myself once shown to me in confidence by a man who worked the company's books and thought Blackwood's dealings ought to be exposed to somebody. Where is it now? I don't know. His voice had gone very quiet. The man who showed it to me died the year after your father's trial. Fever. Nothing suspicious about it, far as I ever heard, though I confess I've wondered. I never saw the ledger again, and I never found who inherited his papers. And 10 years is a long while for a piece of evidence to survive without someone actively keeping it safe. Then it's gone. Might be gone, might not. He looked at her directly, then something steady and deliberate in his gaze. I've had a man asking after it on and off these past years. Quiet inquiries. Nothing that would draw Blackwood's notice, because a man like that, if he thought there was still a ledger out there that could ruin him, would go to whatever lengths necessary to see it destroyed or see the person looking for it silenced. You think he's dangerous. I think a man who let an innocent man hang for his own sins once will not hesitate twice if the stakes are the same. Nathaniel closed the newspaper, finally folding it with a precision that seemed to Elizabeth like the physical form of him trying to fold away everything the paper had stirred up in him. I should have told you all this the day I brought you here. I didn't, because I wasn't certain how much hope to give you, when I've spent 10 years chasing a piece of paper that may not exist anymore. You should have told me, Elizabeth said, but there was no real anger in it, only a kind of astonished gratitude that made her voice unsteady. But I understand why you didn't, and I thank you for telling me now. They sat together a long moment in a silence that had changed character entirely from the silences of the previous 9 days, no longer the careful, guarded quiet of 2 people testing each other's trustworthiness, but something that had begun without either of them quite naming it to feel like companionship. Mr. Whitmore, Elizabeth said eventually, I'd like to help you look. For the ledger. For whatever's left of the truth. It's dangerous work, Miss Carter, if Blackwood ever gets wind of it. My father's name has already been destroyed as thoroughly as a name can be destroyed. I don't have much left to lose that Blackwood could take from me. She met his eyes steadily. But I have everything to gain if there's even the smallest chance of proving what should have been proven 10 years ago. Something in his face watching her softened into an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not quite a smile, but its close cousin, the particular warmth of a man recognizing something in another person that matched something in himself. "Your father would be proud of you," he said quietly. "Same stubborn nerve, the both of you." "I'll take that as the highest compliment you know how to give." "It is," he said, and this time something in his mouth did curve just barely into the shape of a smile that looked unpracticed, and all the more genuine for it. It was 3 days later that Thomas Blackwood came to Whitmore Land for the first time since Elizabeth's arrival, and she was in the yard hanging washing with Mrs. Doyle when the carriage rolled up the drive, fine black lacquer, and a driver in a coat too formal for the summer heat, and Mrs. Doyle's whole body went stiff beside her. "That's him," she said under her breath. "That's Blackwood." Elizabeth turned, and there he was, a heavy-set man in his 50s, silver at the temples, dressed in the particular ostentatious quality of a man who wanted every eye in a room to register the cost of his coat before it registered anything else about him. He stepped down from the carriage with the easy confidence of a man who had never once in his life stood on a stranger's porch begging for work, and his eyes swept across the yard and found Elizabeth almost immediately, and something in his expression sharpened into recognition. "Well," he said, his voice carrying easily across the yard, pitched for an audience, even though there was none but Elizabeth and Mrs. Doyle to hear it. "Miss Carter, I confess I hadn't expected to find you here of all places." "Mr. Blackwood." Elizabeth kept her voice level, though her hands had gone still on the washing, every instinct she possessed telling her this man was dangerous in ways the county's polite society never openly acknowledged. "I heard you'd fallen on hard times." He came closer, and there was something in his manner, a false gentleness laid thin over something colder that made her skin crawl. "It's a hard thing watching a family's fortunes fall so far so fast. Your father, God rest him, brought a great deal of that trouble on himself, though I've always said publicly that I bore him no ill will personally, whatever the courts decided." "How generous of you," Elizabeth said, "to bear no ill will toward a man you destroyed." Blackwood's smile flickered just slightly before resettling into its practiced shape. "I merely reported what the ledgers showed Miss Carter. I take no pleasure in how the matter concluded." "I imagine you take a great deal of pleasure in it, actually, given how thoroughly it served your interests." The smile dropped entirely then, and for one unguarded second, Elizabeth saw something colder underneath it. Something that confirmed everything Nathaniel had told her 3 nights before. Then, the door of the house opened, and Nathaniel Whitmore stepped out onto the porch, and Blackwood's expression rearranged itself instantly back into pleasant neutrality. "Whitmore!" Blackwood's voice had gone smooth again. "I didn't realize you'd taken on the Carter girl as staff. Bold choice given the family's history." "Wasn't asking your opinion on my hiring Blackwood." Nathaniel came down the porch steps, slowly, deliberately, and Elizabeth watched him place himself without seeming to make any point of it at a distance that put him solidly between herself and their visitor. "What brings you out this far from town?" "Business, mostly. There's a matter of grazing rights along the eastern boundary I'd hoped we might discuss." Blackwood's eyes moved briefly back to Elizabeth, and something calculating moved behind them. "Though I confess I'm curious how Miss Carter came to be under your roof. Small county Whitmore. People will talk." "Let them. I only mean to say," Blackwood continued, his tone still smooth but with something harder threading through it now, "that a man in your position, unmarried, respected a great deal to lose, ought to be careful about the company he keeps. The Carter name carries certain associations these days that a wise man wouldn't want attached to his own." The threat, thinly veiled, as concern hung in the summer air between them, and Elizabeth felt her pulse quicken with something that was equal parts fear and fury. "I've never once in my life needed your counsel on how to manage my own affairs." "Blackwood," Nathaniel said, and his voice had dropped into something low and hard that Elizabeth hadn't heard from him before. "And I don't intend to start now. Miss Carter is my employee same as any other, and her business here is her own. You'd do well to remember that, and to remember, too, that I've a long memory for the particular kind of man who tries to threaten what's mine under cover of friendly advice." Something passed across Blackwood's face. Surprise, perhaps, that his usual method of intimidation had failed to land. Or perhaps something more like recognition, the wary respect of one careful man taking the measure of another. "I meant no threat," he said, spreading his hands in a show of easy innocence that fooled no one present. "Only friendly counsel, as I said. We'll discuss the boundary matter another day when tempers have cooled." He turned back toward his carriage, then paused, looking once more at Elizabeth with an expression she would remember for a long time afterward. Not anger exactly, but the cold, patient calculation of a man recalculating a problem he'd believed already solved. "Miss Carter," he said, "do give my regards to your father's memory. Such a shame how thoroughly a good name can be lost." He climbed into his carriage without waiting for a response, and the driver pulled away down the long drive, dust rising behind the wheels, and Elizabeth stood in the yard with her heart hammering, and her hands, she realized only now, curled into fists at her sides. "He knows," she said once the carriage had disappeared from the drive entirely. "He knows we're looking into it, into the ledger, into what really happened. He suspects," Nathaniel corrected, though his own face had gone grim. "There's a difference, and it's a difference that matters. A man who only suspects still has room to be wrong, still has room to leave well enough alone if he judges the risk not worth the trouble." He looked at her, and something in his expression had gone protective in a way that made her chest tighten with an emotion she didn't have a ready name for. "But if he comes to know for certain we're looking, that's a different matter entirely. And I won't have you standing exposed to whatever a man like that decides to do about it." "I didn't. Yeah, I'm not afraid of him." "I didn't say you were. I said I won't have it." His voice had gone quiet again, but there was iron underneath the quiet, now something that hadn't been there before Blackwood's visit. 10 years ago, I sat in a courtroom and watched a good man destroyed because I couldn't get a word in edgewise to stop it. I'll not sit by a second time and watch the same thing happen to his daughter, whatever it cost me to prevent it." Elizabeth looked at him, this quiet, careful man who had spent a decade nursing a debt he never got to pay, who had opened his home and his history to a woman the whole county had already condemned, who now stood in his own yard with his jaw set and his eyes hard, promising a protection she had not asked for and had no right to expect, and she felt something shift in her chest that had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with a feeling she wasn't yet ready to put a name to. "Mr. Whitmore," she said quietly, "I think it's past time you told me everything you know, all of it. Because if Thomas Blackwood is frightened enough of the truth to come here today and threaten you in your own yard, then that ledger isn't merely gone. It's out there somewhere waiting to be found, and he knows it as well as we do." Nathaniel Whitmore looked at her for a long moment, the summer light going gold around them, the dust of Blackwood's departure still hanging faintly in the air, and something settled behind his eyes. Not quite decision, but the beginning of one. "Come inside," he said finally. "There's more to tell than I've told you yet, and I think it's time you heard all of it." Nathaniel led her back through the front hall and into the study, and this time he did not sit behind the desk the way he had before. He pulled the second chair around so it stood beside hers rather than across from it, and Elizabeth understood, without either of them remarking on it, that something in the arrangement had changed. They were no longer employer and employee discussing a matter of business. They were two people who had just watched the same enemy stand in the same yard, and something about shared danger collapsed distance faster than shared meals ever could. His name was Josiah Abernathy, Nathaniel said without preamble, as if he'd been holding the name behind his teeth the whole walk back from the yard and needed to let it out before it choked him. Clerk for the shipping company in Richmond that carried Blackwood's debts. Careful man, methodical, kept better books for another man's money than most men keep for their own. And he's the one who showed you the ledger. He came to me himself, rode 2 days to do it on his own horse on his own coin, because he'd read in the Richmond papers what was happening to your father, and he knew the shape of Blackwood's debts well enough to know something wasn't sitting right. Nathaniel's hands were folded on his knee, still deliberately still, the way Elizabeth was beginning to understand meant he was holding something down by force. "Showed me 11 months of entries. Blackwood had borrowed against 3 separate ventures that had all gone bad within the same year, owed more than he could ever have covered, honest, and the timing of it lined up close enough with the missing relief funds that a blind man could have drawn the connection. Why didn't he go to the county himself? Why come to you? Said he didn't trust the county to hear a stranger from Richmond over a man they'd known their whole lives. Said I'd stood up for fair dealing before in some business between us years back, and he reckoned I was the one man in the county with both the standing and the stomach to carry it forward. Something moved through Nathaniel's jaw, tight and controlled. I carried it forward straight into a courtroom that wouldn't let me open my mouth. And Abernathy, what happened to him? Fever took him the following spring. Nathaniel's voice had gone very quiet. I told you that part already. What I didn't tell you is that I've never been fully at peace with how sudden it came on him. Healthy man, no history of weak lungs, dead inside 9 days of first taking sick. Might be nothing. Fevers take strong men, same as weak ones, every summer. No reason behind it, but bad luck and bad water. He looked at her directly. Might be nothing at all, but I've never once managed to convince myself of it all the way through. Elizabeth felt something cold settle low in her stomach. You think Blackwood had a hand in it? I've no proof of that, and I'll not accuse a man of murder with nothing behind the accusation, but a feeling I can't shake. He shook his head once sharp, as if physically throwing the thought off before it could take further root. What I do know is that Abernathy had a daughter, Margaret, lived with him in Richmond, kept his house after his wife passed. I wrote to her the year after he died, asking whether her father had left behind any papers relating to his old employer's accounts. And no answer. Not one word, not that year, nor the year after, though I wrote twice more, trying. Something bitter crossed his face. Told myself she'd simply moved on, wanted no part of a dead man's business troubles, which is a reasonable enough thing for a grieving daughter to want. But sitting in that yard just now, watching Blackwood look at you, the way a man looks at a debt he thought he'd already collected. He stopped, jaw working. I've started wondering if her silence wasn't grief at all. I've started wondering if somebody made certain she'd stay quiet. Elizabeth sat with that for a long moment, feeling the shape of the whole ugly picture assembling itself in her mind, the way her father used to lay out a case fact by fact until the pattern beneath the facts became impossible to ignore. We should write to her again, she said. I've tried 3 times already, Miss Carter. You tried as Nathaniel Whitmore, a name she may already have been warned against if Blackwood got to her first. Elizabeth leaned forward, something sharpening in her, now that had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with the particular clarity that came over her when a problem finally had an edge she could get her hands around. Let me write to her, woman to woman. Elizabeth Carter, daughter of the man her father tried to help. That's a different letter than the ones she's ignored before. Nathaniel studied her, and something in his face softened into an expression she was starting to recognize, not quite admiration, though close to it, something closer to the particular respect one careful mind pays another when it recognizes its equal. You're not wrong, he said. Might work where mine didn't. Then I'll write it tonight. Elizabeth. It was the first time he'd used her given name, and the sound of it in his rough, unpracticed voice landed somewhere in her chest, with more weight than the moment strictly called for. He seemed to hear himself say it and hesitate, as though deciding whether to take it back, and then deliberately did not. If Blackwood's already gotten to her, a letter with your name on it is a letter that puts your name in front of him again, plain as day. I don't take that lightly. My name's already in front of him, Mr. Whitmore. He stood in your yard not an hour ago and said it to my face. She held his gaze steadily. I'd rather spend whatever risk I've already got hanging over me trying to prove something true than spend it standing still and hoping he loses interest. He didn't argue further. He simply nodded once, the particular economical gesture of a man conceding a point he'd expected to lose, and reached for paper and ink from the desk drawer and set them in front of her without another word. She wrote the letter that night at his desk by lamplight while he sat across the room pretending to read a ledger he wasn't reading, and when she finished, she read it aloud to him. Plain words, an honest account of who she was and what had happened to her father. An appeal made daughter to daughter, grief to grief. And when she looked up from the page, she found him watching her with an expression he didn't try to hide fast enough this time. "That's a fine letter," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "You sound surprised." "I'm not surprised. He stopped, seemed to reconsider several words before landing on one. "Moved, I suppose, though I'm not a man practiced at saying so." "You're getting more practiced by the day, Mr. Whitmore." Something that might almost have been a real smile crossed his face, then brief but unguarded. And Elizabeth found herself smiling back before she'd decided to, and for a moment the study felt warm in a way that had nothing to do with the lamp. The letter went out with the morning post carried into town by Nathaniel's own hand, because he trusted the errand to no one else, and Elizabeth went with him, partly because the household needed supplies, and partly because 4 months of solitary begging along Virginia's roads had left her with a hunger for ordinary errands, ordinary chores, the particular dignity of walking into a shop with coin in hand instead of an outstretched palm. She should have known better than to hope the town would let her have it. The general store sat at the crossroads at the center of town, the same crossroads more or less, where a stopped carriage had changed the entire shape of her life 9 days before. And Elizabeth walked into it beside Nathaniel, with a small list in her hand, and a feeling in her chest that was almost foolishly close to lightness. The feeling lasted as long as it took the woman behind the counter to look up and recognize her. Mrs. Pemberton had run the store for as long as Elizabeth could remember. A heavy-set woman with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue. And Elizabeth watched those sharp eyes travel from her face to Nathaniel, standing a step behind her and back again, and watched the whole shape of the woman's expression curdle in real time. "Well," Mrs. Pemberton said, setting down the ledger she'd been working in with a deliberate little thump. "Never thought I'd see the Carter girl walking into my store on the arm of Nathaniel Whitmore." "I'm not on his arm, Mrs. Pemberton. I'm here for flour and thread, same as anyone." "Same as anyone?" Mrs. Pemberton's mouth twisted around the words like they tasted bad. "Word around town is you've taken up residence out at Whitmore land. Unmarried woman under a bachelor's roof, no family to speak for her propriety. My husband says it's not our business what a woman does with her reputation once she's already lost the better part of it, but I say a store's got a right to choose who it serves, same as anybody." The words landed like a slap, and Elizabeth felt her face go hot, felt the old familiar reflex to shrink, to apologize, to make herself smaller and less troublesome. And then standing there in the middle of the store with half a dozen other customers, suddenly finding great interest in the shelves nearest them, she felt something else rise up. Instead, something that tasted more like her father's stubbornness than her own fear. There is a housekeeper in that home, Mrs. Pemberton, same as there'd be in any respectable household, and I am employed there doing honest work for honest wages, same as I'd be employed anywhere that had the decency to hire me instead of judging me by a name the newspapers got wrong 10 years ago. Her voice came out steadier than she felt, which she counted as its own small victory. "I'll thank you to keep your speculation about my propriety to yourself, and to sell me my flour, since my coin spends the same as anybody else's." A ripple moved through the store murmurs, a few sharp, indrawn breaths, and Mrs. Pemberton's face went red with an anger that had clearly expected an apology rather than a rebuttal. "I don't have to serve you a single thing, girl, and I don't intend to." "Yes," Nathaniel said, stepping forward, now his voice quiet, but carrying easily through the sudden silence of the store. "You do, Mrs. Pemberton, on account of the county license that hangs above your door, requires you serve any paying customer, regardless of your personal opinion of them, same as it required my father before me, and yours before that. I've no interest in reporting you to the county clerk over a sack of flour, but I'll do it without a second thought if you make me." Mrs. Pemberton's mouth worked silently for a moment, torn between fury and the plain arithmetic of a threat she couldn't afford to test. And in that silence, a new voice cut through from further back in the store. "Oh, for heaven's sake, Dorothy, sell the girl her flour and be done with it." An older woman came forward from among the shelves, gray-haired, sharp-eyed, in a different way than Mrs. Pemberton, the sharpness of someone who'd seen enough of the world to have run clean out of patience for its smaller cruelties. I remember Elizabeth's father representing my late husband's estate free of charge when we hadn't 2 coins to rub together after the fever took him, and I'll not stand here and listen to his daughter be spoken to like she's something scraped off a boot. Mrs. Pruitt, this isn't your business. I'm making it my business. Mrs. Pruitt came to stand beside Elizabeth close enough that the gesture read plainly to everyone watching as a choosing of sides, and something in Elizabeth's chest ached at the unexpected kindness of it, sharp and sudden, as the cruelty had been a moment before. Girl's got a right to buy her flour same as the rest of us. And if you won't sell it to her, Dorothy, I'll take my custom to the store in Fredericksburg from now on and tell every woman I know to do the same. The threat to her livelihood succeeded where the threat of the county clerk had only half landed. Mrs. Pemberton's face went through several more shades of color before she finally grudgingly reached for the flour sack behind her, slamming it down on the counter hard enough to raise a small cloud of white dust. "Fine," she snapped. "Take your flour, but don't expect a warm welcome in this town, girl, whatever coin you've got to spend. Some things a name doesn't wash clean of, no matter how many rich men take up your cause." Elizabeth counted out her coins with hands that were only slightly unsteady and did not dignify the last remark with a response. And it was only once they were back out on the street, the store door closing behind them, with the particular finality of a door that would not be opened warmly again any time soon, that she let out the breath she'd been holding through the whole exchange. "Are you all right?" Nathaniel asked, his voice low, his eyes searching her face with a concern he made no effort to hide now that they were away from watching eyes. "I've had worse said to me these past 4 months. I've simply never had someone stand beside me while it was being said." She looked at him, something in her chest still tender from Mrs. Pruitt's unexpected defense, from his own quiet threat of the county clerk delivered without a moment's hesitation. "Thank you for not letting that stand. Wasn't going to watch a woman insulted in a public store and say nothing about it. Wouldn't matter who the woman was. Wouldn't it?" He looked at her for a long moment, something working behind his eyes that he seemed to be deciding whether to say aloud. And then Mrs. Pruitt came out of the store behind them, adjusting her bonnet, and the moment folded itself closed before he'd answered. "Elizabeth Carter," Mrs. Pruitt said, coming to stand in front of her with a directness that reminded Elizabeth sharply of her own mother. "I don't believe we've been properly introduced since you were a girl of 12 sitting quiet as a mouse in the back pew while your father argued a case for half the county for free. You favor him. Same stubborn set to the chin." "Thank you, Mrs. Pruitt, truly. You didn't have to say what you said in there. I've buried a husband and outlived most of my patience for foolishness, dear. Standing up for what's plainly right costs me nothing at my age but the goodwill of women like Dorothy Pemberton, and I find I sleep just fine without it." She patted Elizabeth's arm, brisk and warm at once. "Your father was a good man. Whatever the county decided in that courtroom, there are those of us who never stopped knowing it and never will." She went on her way down the street before Elizabeth could find the words to properly thank her, leaving behind a warmth that sat strangely alongside the sting of Mrs. Pemberton's cruelty. The two feelings tangled together in a way that left Elizabeth unsteady on her feet as they walked back toward the carriage. "There's more of them than you think," Nathaniel said quietly, as if he'd read the confusion on her face. "People who remember your father true, who never believe the worst of him. They just don't shout it in public the way Blackwood shouts his lies on account of the truth doesn't need shouting the way a lie does." "I hope you're right. I generally am about people, if not much else." A dry note had crept into his voice, and Elizabeth found herself, despite everything, almost laughing. Chapter. The ride back to Whitmore Land was quieter than the ride into town had been, and Elizabeth spent a portion of it simply watching him, the careful way he held the reins, the tension still visible in his shoulders from the confrontation in the store, the particular stillness that settled over him whenever his mind was working through something he hadn't decided how to voice yet. "You went cold when Blackwood mentioned your name to me in the yard," she said finally. "Colder than I've seen you even reading that old newspaper. Why?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer at all, Because I know exactly what a man like Blackwood does to people who stand in his way, he said finally. I watched him do it to your father. I've watched him do smaller versions of it to half a dozen families in this county over the years. Buy up a debt here, spread a rumor. They make life just difficult enough that a man decides it's easier to stop asking questions than to keep asking them. His hands tightened slightly on the reins. I've spent 10 years being careful never to give him a reason to turn that particular attention on me. Kept my head down, kept my business my own. Let him think me too quiet and too solitary to ever be worth the trouble of watching closely. And now I've got a woman under my roof whose very name is a standing accusation against everything he's built his reputation on. And I've written letters to Richmond asking questions he'd very much rather stayed unasked. And I've just publicly threatened to report Dorothy Pemberton to the county clerk in front of half the town, which is about as loud a thing as I've done in a decade. He glanced at her sideways, something wry and rueful in the look. I expect my quiet years are coming to an end, one way or another. Does that frighten you? Some. He said it plainly without shame in the admission. But I find I mind it less than I expected to. They rode the rest of the way in a silence that had turned comfortable again, and Elizabeth found her mind drifting unbidden to the moment outside the store, when he'd started to answer her question. Wouldn't it matter who the woman was, and hadn't finished? And she wondered with a flutter in her chest. She wasn't entirely ready to examine what the rest of that sentence might have been. They were still a half-mile from the house when they saw the boy running toward them down the middle of the road, and Elizabeth recognized the thin frame and the crushed hat, even before she could make out his face clearly. And something in her stomach dropped at the sight of him running rather than walking, because boys in this county had learned young that running toward trouble rather than away from it was a message all its own. Nathaniel pulled the horses up hard, and Hensley reached the carriage out of breath, his face pale and streaked with what might have been dust or might have been tears, and he grabbed at the carriage door before it had fully stopped moving. Mr. Whitmore, they came to our place, man, came with papers. Said Mama owes on a note she never signed, said if we don't pay by week's end, they'll take the house and the land, both. Slow down, son. Who came? Man named Crane, Silas Crane. Said he works for Mr. Blackwood. The boy's voice cracked. Said the note's for money my pa borrowed years back before he died, and that it's come due, and Mama's crying something awful, because we ain't got that kind of money. We ain't got a fraction of it, and Crane said if we can't pay, he'll have the sheriff out to put us off the land by Sunday. Elizabeth felt the blood go cold in her veins. Even as beside her, she watched something harden in Nathaniel's face into an expression she hadn't seen from him before, not the controlled stillness she'd come to expect, but something sharper, something with teeth in it. Your father never held a note with Blackwood, Nathaniel said. I know for a fact he didn't, because I helped settle your father's debts myself after he passed, and there was no note to Blackwood among them. That's what I told Crane, sir, only he had papers. Real papers with my pa's name signed right on them, and Mama looked at the signature and said it looked near enough like his hand that she couldn't rightly say it was forged, not with her eyes the way they are now. Get in, Nathaniel said, already turning the carriage. We're going to your place now. The ride to the Hensley farm took less than 10 minutes, but Elizabeth spent every one of them watching Nathaniel's hands tighten and loosen on the reins, in a rhythm that told her plainly how much effort it cost him to keep the horses at a controlled pace, rather than a dead run. And when the small farmhouse came into view, modest, well-kept despite its poverty, a woman standing on the porch wringing a dish towel between hands that wouldn't stay still. He was down from the carriage almost before it had fully stopped. Mrs. Hensley? Mr. Whitmore. The woman's voice broke on his name relief and terror tangled together. I don't know what to do. He said Sunday. He said if we can't pay, he'll have the sheriff. Nobody's putting you off this land, Mrs. Hensley. Not while I've breath in my body to prevent it. Nathaniel's voice had gone gentle in a way Elizabeth hadn't heard from him before, careful with the woman's fear, the way he'd been careful with the boy's shame 9 days earlier. Where's this note Crane showed you? He didn't leave it. Said he'd be back Sunday with the sheriff, and I could see it proper then, if I hadn't the money in hand. Her hands twisted the dish towel tighter. "I know my husband's hand, Mr. Whitmore. I've read enough of his letters to know it. And what Crane showed me, it looked close. It looked close enough that I couldn't swear against it, not with my old eyes, not with him standing there so certain." Elizabeth stepped forward, something clicking into place in her mind, with the particular cold clarity she'd inherited from 4 years of watching her father dissect a fraudulent claim. "Mrs. Hensley did. Mr. Crane let you hold the paper. Examine it closely in good light." "No, miss. Held it up for me to see, but didn't hand it over." That's the first sign of a forgery in my experience. A genuine debt a man's happy enough to let you examine at your leisure because the truth of it doesn't fear close looking. A forged one needs to be shown quick and taken back quicker before anyone's had time to notice what doesn't sit right. Elizabeth felt the old familiar sharpness settling over her, the particular competence that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the training her father had given her, without either of them ever calling it training. "My father taught me to spot a forged signature by the pressure of the pen, the places where a hand copying another man's writing hesitates that the original hand never would. If Crane comes back Sunday, I want to see that paper myself in full daylight before anyone signs a single thing or hands over a single coin." Mrs. Hensley looked between Elizabeth and Nathaniel with an expression caught between hope and confusion. "You think it's false, a forgery entire?" "I think Thomas Blackwood has just discovered that threatening a grown woman under Mr. Whitmore's protection carries certain risks he'd rather not take directly," Elizabeth said, "and I think he's found a smaller, softer target to strike at, instead to remind everyone within earshot exactly what happens to people connected to this household who dare ask questions he doesn't like answered." Nathaniel's jaw had gone tight as granite. "That's precisely what this is." "Sunday," Mrs. Hensley said again, her voice thin. "He said, Sunday Mr. Whitmore and I don't have 3 days' worth of proof that a signature's false, not against a man with lawyers and money enough to make the sheriff believe whatever he tells him." "You don't need 3 days," Nathaniel said. "You need me standing beside you when Crane comes back, and you need to know that whatever that note claims you owe, it's paid in full, the moment he sets foot on this land, whether it's real or false. Because I'll not have this family put out of their home over a debt, real or invented, while there's coin in my own accounts to prevent it." "Mr. Whitmore, I can't ask that of you." "You're not asking. I'm offering same as I offered Miss Carter 9 days back on the road, and I'll thank you not to argue with a man trying to do right by a family that's done nothing wrong." Something had crept into his voice that Elizabeth hadn't heard before. Not quite anger, but the controlled, dangerous edge of a man who had spent a decade watching one family after another get ground down by the same slow machinery of debt and intimidation, and was finally done standing by and watching it happen without a fight. "But Miss Carter's right, that we ought to know the truth of that paper before any money changes hands, forged or not, because if it's forged, that's evidence in itself. Evidence of exactly the kind of man Thomas Blackwood really is, and evidence I intend to put to use." "See you, Ise." Elizabeth felt something warm move through her chest at the sound of her own name paired with his trust in her judgment, and she pushed the feeling aside for the moment, because there was work still to be done, and Mrs. Hensley's face was still tight with fear that needed addressing. "When Crane comes Sunday," Elizabeth said, "let him do the talking first. Let him show his paper, let him make his threats, and say nothing yourself, beyond asking to examine it closely in good light before you'll consider any payment. Mr. Whitmore and I will be here. We'll examine it together. And if he won't hand it over for examining, then that refusal tells us everything we need to know," Elizabeth said. "And Mr. Whitmore can decide what's to be done about a man who shows up demanding payment on a debt he won't let anyone look at closely." Mrs. Hensley's shoulders came down half an inch, the particular unclenching of a woman who has just been handed a plan, where before there had only been dread, and she reached out and gripped Elizabeth's hand with both of her own, hard enough to hurt. "Bless you, miss. Bless the both of you." Chunk. They rode back to Whitmore land as the light was failing, and Elizabeth found herself watching the fields go gold and then gray around them, her mind still turning over the shape of what they'd just learned, That Blackwood's campaign wasn't confined to Elizabeth alone, that it had teeth reaching into families who'd done nothing but exist within the orbit of a man he wanted silenced. "How many families in this county has he done this to?" she asked quietly. "More than I can count with certainty. Fewer than I fear." Nathaniel's voice had gone tired in a way she hadn't heard from him before, the particular exhaustion of a man who had spent years fighting a battle mostly alone and was only now for the first time fighting it beside someone. He's careful. Spreads it thin, spaces it out, makes each single instance look like ordinary hard luck, rather than what it really is, a pattern deliberate, aimed at keeping this whole county too frightened and too fractured to ever stand against him in one piece. That's why my father's trial went the way it did. Elizabeth said it slowly, the pieces settling into place with the particular cold click of understanding, arriving all at once after circling for a long while. It wasn't only that Blackwood lied convincingly. It's that by the time it came to trial, he'd already spent years making certain no one in this county had the courage or the unity to stand against whatever story he told. That's the shape of it, yes. Then the ledger isn't just proof of one theft, one lie told about one man. It's proof of the whole machine he's built. Nathaniel looked at her, something almost startled in his expression, as though she'd articulated a thought he'd carried inarticulately for years, without ever managing to put it into words so cleanly. "You've got your father's mind for this, sure enough." "I mean to use it," Elizabeth said, and found saying it aloud that some old fear inside her, the fear that had driven her along Virginia's roads for 4 months, begging at doors small and apologetic, and ashamed of a name that wasn't hers to be ashamed of, had gone very quiet. They reached the house as full dark was settling, and Mrs. Doyle met them at the door with a face already tight with news of her own, a letter held out in one hand. "This came for you, Mr. Whitmore, not an hour after you left. Writer brought it out special, wouldn't say who sent him, only that it was urgent." Nathaniel took the letter, and Elizabeth watched his face change as he broke the seal and scanned the first lines. The particular stillness of a man reading something that mattered enormously, controlling his reaction by long practice, even as his eyes moved faster down the page. "It's from Richmond," he said finally, his voice low. "Not addressed to me. Addressed to you." Elizabeth's heart stuttered. "Margaret Abernathy." "Read it," he said, and handed it over, and Elizabeth's hands were not quite steady as she took it and moved closer to the lamp Mrs. Doyle had lit against the gathering dark. "Miss Carter, your letter reached me, and I confess I read it 3 times before I could bring myself to answer it, and I am answering now only because your words about your own father moved something in me. I had thought long since gone quiet. I must ask you to understand that I have not written to Mr. Whitmore these past years, not because I did not wish to, but because I was frightened to. A man came to see me some 8 years past, not long after my father's passing. He did not give his true name, but he asked after my father's old papers, with a particular interest that left me unable to sleep easy for a long while after. I told him truthfully that I had burned most of my father's business correspondence in my grief, wanting no reminder of the work that had, I believe, hastened his end. This was not entirely true. I kept certain papers in a place he did not think to look, because some instinct in me said they mattered, though I did not then understand why. I have never dared examine them closely, Miss Carter, for fear of what I might find myself responsible for knowing. But your letter has convinced me that the time for that fear has passed. If you and Mr. Whitmore are willing to come to Richmond quietly and without announcing your business to anyone along the way, I believe I can show you something that will matter a great deal to you both. Come soon. I do not know how long my courage will hold now that I have written this much down. Margaret Abernathy. Elizabeth looked up from the letter to find Nathaniel watching her, and something electric passed between them. Equal parts triumph and fear, the particular vertigo of a door long searched for finally unexpectedly standing open. She has them, Elizabeth said, her voice unsteady. The papers. She still has them. She has something, Nathaniel said carefully. We won't know what until we see it with our own eyes. But even as he said it, Elizabeth could see something kindling behind the caution in his face. 10 years of patient grinding hope finally given a direction to run. When can we leave? Richmond's the better part of 2 days' ride, and I'll not have you traveling that road with what's happened today still fresh. Blackwood's already shown he'll strike at whoever stands nearest to us. He was already thinking through it. She could see the particular fast calculation of a man used to managing risk. We'll need to leave quiet, like she says. No announcement in town, no word to anyone beyond Mrs. Doyle. I'm coming with you. Elizabeth. It's my father's name at stake, Mr. Whitmore. My father's ruin this evidence might finally undo. I did not walk 4 months of Virginia roads begging strangers for bread, only to sit safely at home while someone else finishes the fight I've been fighting my whole life without knowing it. Her voice had gone hard, and she watched something in his face soften at the sound of it. Recognition, rather than argument. I'm coming with you. He studied her a long moment in the lamplight, and whatever battle he was fighting behind his eyes, the old instinct to protect warring against something that looked unmistakably like respect, resolved itself, the way it had resolved itself once already on a dusty road 9 days before, into simple acceptance of a decision that wasn't his to make alone. Then we leave before first light, he said. Quiet as we can manage. She could not sleep that night. She lay in the narrow bed in the east room, with the window open to the summer dark, listening to the ordinary night sounds of the farm crickets, a distant owl, the occasional shift and stamp of a horse in the barn, and her mind would not settle, running instead over every fact she'd gathered since that first door had closed against her, arranging and rearranging them into the shape of a case her father would have been proud to argue. She was still awake near midnight by her guess when she heard a sound that didn't belong among the ordinary night sounds. A low, urgent shout from the direction of the barn, followed almost immediately by the unmistakable gut-dropping smell of smoke. She was out of bed and at the window before conscious thought caught up with her body, and what she saw through the dark stopped her heart. Cold, an orange glow flickering low along the barn's near wall, and a figure, small fast, already sprinting away toward the tree line, at the edge of the property, visible for only a heartbeat, before it vanished into the dark. Fire! Her own voice tore out of her before she'd decided to use it. Fire in the barn. She was down the stairs and out the door in the same motion, bare feet hitting the porch boards, and she saw Nathaniel already crossing the yard at a dead run, half-dressed, a bucket already in each hand, and behind him, Mrs. Doyle's voice raised in the particular sharp alarm of a household waking all at once to disaster. Get the horses out first. Nathaniel's voice cracked across the yard like a whip. Elizabeth the well, start the bucket line. She ran. She ran barefoot across the yard with her nightdress catching at her ankles, the smell of smoke thickening with every stride, and by the time she reached the well, the whole side of the barn nearest the tree line was lit. Orange flames climbing the old dry timber faster than any accident had a right to climb. Bucket! Nathaniel's voice tore through the chaos, and one of the hands, a broad-shouldered man named Coyle, who slept in the bunkhouse nearest the barn, was already at the well beside her, hauling the rope hand over hand. Elizabeth grabbed the first full bucket the moment it cleared the well's stone lip water sloshing cold over her wrists, and she ran it toward the fire line where Nathaniel and 2 other hands had formed a ragged chain passing buckets, man to man, woman to man. The old desperate rhythm of people fighting to save something that fire didn't care whether they saved or not. Get the horses clear! Nathaniel shouted again, and through the smoke, Elizabeth saw Hensley's small shape the boy had come running from wherever he'd been sleeping that night. Or perhaps had simply appeared the way frightened children appear at the sound of trouble, hauling open the barn's near doors, ducking low under the smoke to get at the frightened, screaming horses inside. Hensley, no! Elizabeth's heart lurched into her throat as the boy vanished into the smoke, and she was moving before she'd decided to move, dropping her bucket running for the barn door herself, because a woman who had already lost everything once was not about to stand by and watch a child run into fire for the sake of livestock. Elizabeth? Nathaniel's voice cracked with something raw and furious. Get back. But Hensley was already emerging, coughing, dragging the lead rope of the first terrified horse behind him, and Elizabeth caught the animal's halter and hauled it clear toward the paddock fence, while the boy went back for the second. And for 3 full minutes, the world narrowed down to nothing but smoke and heat, and the animal panic of horses who didn't understand that the humans dragging them by main force toward the dark were trying to save their lives. They got both horses clear. They got the fire eventually beaten back to smoldering ruin along one wall, rather than the whole structure lost. Though the damage was bad enough, a full third of the barn's near side collapsed inward, black and steaming, the smell of scorched wood and hay hanging thick over the whole yard, even after the flames themselves had died to embers. Elizabeth stood in the aftermath with her hands blistered and her lungs raw, watching Nathaniel move through the wreckage, checking each horse, each hand, his face a mask of controlled fury that she recognized now as the particular quality he wore when the thing underneath was too large to let show plainly. "Anyone hurt?" His voice was hoarse from smoke. "Coyle's got a burn on his hand. Nothing serious," one of the men called back. "Rest of us are whole." Hensley. The boy stepped forward, soot-streaked, still breathing hard. "I'm fine, sir." Nathaniel crossed to him in 3 strides and did something Elizabeth hadn't expected, gripped the boy by both shoulders hard, and held him there a moment, searching his face with an intensity that had nothing to do with anger. "You ran into a burning barn, son. You understand what could have happened to you in there?" "Yes, sir. Horses were screaming. Couldn't just leave them." "No." Nathaniel said, something breaking loose in his voice. "I don't suppose you could." He pulled the boy into a rough one-armed embrace that lasted only a second before he released him, cleared his throat and turned away, and Elizabeth understood she had just watched this careful, guarded man come as close to weeping in front of witnesses as he was ever likely to allow himself. It was Mrs. Doyle moving along the fire line with a lantern who found the thing that turned the whole night from accident to attack. "Mr. Whitmore." Her voice had a different quality now, sharp and cold. "You'd best come see this." She led him to the barn's near corner, the one closest to where Elizabeth had seen the fleeing figure vanish into the trees, and held her lantern low over a patch of ground that hadn't burned. Elizabeth came to look over Nathaniel's shoulder and felt her stomach drop. A rag half-burned, still smelling faintly of coal oil. And beside it, driven into the dirt with deliberate care, a folded piece of paper that had somehow survived the fire's edge, weighted down with a stone. Nathaniel picked it up with hands that had gone very still and unfolded it and read it in silence for a long moment before he handed it to Elizabeth without a word. "Some fires burn quiet, some don't. Keep asking questions and see which kind visits your house next." There was no signature. There didn't need to be one. "He's escalated," Nathaniel said, his voice gone flat and cold in a way that frightened Elizabeth more than shouting would have. "Threatening the Hensleys wasn't enough of a message. Now he's threatening me direct in my own yard with fire that could have killed every soul on this property. We should go to the sheriff. The sheriff in this county owes half his election to Blackwood's money, Elizabeth. He'll take a report, write it up polite, and do nothing at all, same as he's done nothing about every other piece of trouble that man's caused for a decade." Nathaniel's jaw was set like stone. "This note's proof enough for us. It's not proof enough for a court, not without more behind it. Which means Richmond matters more tonight than it did yesterday, not less. You still mean to go?" "I mean to go faster than I planned, and quieter, and I mean to leave enough men here watching this property that whoever set that fire thinks twice about trying again while we're gone." He looked at her, smoke-stained and soot-streaked in the gray edge of coming dawn, and something in his expression had hardened into pure resolve. "We leave within the hour, before Blackwood's got time to hear what happened here tonight and adjust whatever he's planning next." They rode out as the sky was just beginning to lighten, Nathaniel driving the smaller, faster carriage himself, rather than trusting the errand to a driver who might be watched or questioned along the road. And Elizabeth sat beside him, with her hands still faintly stinging from bucket rope and fire heat, watching Whitmore land fall away behind them, and feeling for the first time since she'd climbed into his carriage 9 days before, genuinely afraid. "He tried to kill people last night," she said once the farm had disappeared behind the tree line. "Not threaten, not intimidate. He set a fire in a barn full of animals and sleeping men, and he didn't care who burned." "No," Nathaniel agreed grimly. "I don't believe he did." "Then this isn't only about a stolen inheritance anymore, or a ruined name. This is a man who's shown he'll kill to keep his secrets buried. It always was that, Elizabeth. We only didn't have proof of it plain enough to say so out loud until last night." He kept his eyes on the road, his hands steady on the reins despite everything. "Which is precisely why we can't turn back now. A man who's shown his hand this plainly isn't a man who's going to stop escalating on his own. The only way this ends is if we finish what your father started 10 years ago, before Blackwood finishes what he started last night." They rode hard through the first day, stopping only to rest the horses, and Elizabeth found the miles passing in a strange blur of exhaustion and adrenaline, her mind circling endlessly between fear for the people they'd left behind and a fierce burning hope that Richmond might finally deliver the proof that could end all of it. It was well into the second day, the road narrowing as it wound closer to the city, when Nathaniel broke a long silence with something that had clearly been sitting in him a while. "Elizabeth." His voice had gone careful, in a way she'd learned to recognize as meaning something difficult was coming. "Last night, when you ran for that barn door. When Hensley went in after the horses. I want you to understand something about how that looked to me standing there. You were angry at me for going in." "I was terrified," he said, and the word landed with unexpected weight coming from a man who so rarely admitted to feeling anything plainly. "Not angry. Terrified watching you run toward fire, understanding in that moment that if something happened to you in there, I'd have no one to blame but myself for bringing you into a fight that's put a target on your back that wasn't there before I stopped my carriage on that road. I chose to come with you that day. I've chosen every step since." She looked at him steadily. "Whatever dangers found me since, I don't regret a moment of choosing it. I know that." His voice had gone rough. "Doesn't make the terror any less watching you run into smoke, same as watching that boy run in after horses. There's people I've learned to care about again this past 9 days, after years of keeping myself from caring about anybody past what duty required. That's a harder thing to lose a second time than I think you understand." Elizabeth felt her breath catch, understanding, without either of them saying it plainly, that he was speaking of more than duty, more than a debt owed to a dead friend. And something in her own chest answered that admission, with a warmth she hadn't let herself examine too closely in the days since that first carriage ride. "You won't lose me, Nathaniel," she said softly, using his given name for the first time, and watched something shift in his face at the sound of it. "I've survived worse than fire these past 4 months. I don't intend to stop surviving now, not when we're finally close to something that might matter." He didn't answer in words. He simply reached over without looking away from the road and found her hand where it rested on the carriage seat between them and held it briefly firmly before returning his attention fully to the horses. And Elizabeth sat with the warmth of that touch long after his hand had returned to the reins, understanding that something between them had shifted onto ground that had nothing to do with debts or employment, or her father's memory at all. Pat's, Richmond. When they finally reached it in the gray light of early evening on the second day, was louder and larger than anything Elizabeth had encountered in months of quiet Virginia roads, and she found the noise of it carts and vendors, and the particular hum of a city going about its business almost disorienting after the careful stillness of Whitmore land. Margaret Abernathy's house sat on a modest street of modest houses, respectable but unremarkable, and the woman who opened the door to their knock was younger than Elizabeth had expected, perhaps 30, with tired eyes and a wariness in her posture that spoke of years spent flinching at unexpected callers. "Miss Carter." Her eyes moved between Elizabeth and Nathaniel with obvious apprehension. "And you'll be Mr. Whitmore, then." "Thank you for writing to me," Elizabeth said, "for trusting us enough to ask us here." "I'm not certain trust is the word for it." Margaret's laugh was thin, humorless. "Fear, perhaps. Fear of what it means holding on to something this long without ever having the courage to look at it properly. She stepped back from the door. "Come in quickly. I'd rather my neighbors not take particular note of who's calling." The inside of the house was neat but sparse. The particular careful poverty of a woman managing alone on limited means, and Margaret led them to a small sitting room where a single lamp burned low against the gathering dark. "My father died, believing he'd done right. Coming to you, Mr. Whitmore," Margaret said once they were seated, her hands folded tight in her lap. "I've spent 8 years wondering whether that belief cost him his life. I've never been able to prove it one way or the other, and I've told myself for years that not looking at his papers meant not having to know for certain." "You don't have to show us anything you're not ready to show us," Elizabeth said gently. "I know I don't have to." Margaret's chin came up with a determination that reminded Elizabeth sharply of her own reflection in whatever mirror had watched her walk those Virginia roads for 4 months. "But your letter said something that stayed with me, Miss Carter. You said your father died still believing people could be better than the worst thing done to them. I've spent 8 years letting fear be the whole of my inheritance from my own father. I find I'm tired of that particular inheritance." She rose and crossed to a cabinet in the corner, and from behind a false back panel worked loose with practiced fingers that told Elizabeth this was not the first time Margaret had touched this hiding place. Only the first time she'd meant to bring what was hidden out into the light. She withdrew a slim, leather-bound ledger and a small bundle of letters tied with faded string. "This is everything," Margaret said, setting them on the table between them with hands that trembled only slightly. "My father's own accounting of every debt Thomas Blackwood ever carried through that shipping company, dated and itemized in his own hand. And these," she touched the bundle of letters, "these are letters between Blackwood and a man named Silas Crane, going back near 11 years. My father kept them because Crane worked as a kind of agent for Blackwood in matters Blackwood didn't want his own name attached to. I never read past the first 2. I couldn't bring myself to." Elizabeth's hands were unsteady as she reached for the ledger, and Nathaniel leaned close beside her. Both of them bent over the small lamp reading in a silence that stretched taut as a drawn wire. The numbers told the story exactly as Nathaniel had described it. Years of debt piling upon debt. 3 failed ventures within a single year. A shortfall that lined up month for month with the timing of the relief funds missing $800. But it was the letters that made Elizabeth's breath catch, because there in Blackwood's own hand, dated 3 weeks before her father's arrest, was a line that turned her blood to ice. "Carter's found the discrepancy himself. Fool went straight to the committee before I could arrange matters otherwise. We'll need to move quickly if the story is to hold best, if suspicion falls on the man who reported it before he has cause to look further into where the money truly went." "He knew," Elizabeth whispered. "He knew my father was innocent from the very beginning. This isn't a man who got lucky when accusations fell the wrong way. This is a man who planned it deliberately the moment he learned my father had found him out." "There's more," Margaret said quietly, and Elizabeth turned the page with hands that had gone entirely numb and found a second letter. This one dated only 8 months past. "The Carter girls taken up residence at Whitmore's place. Whitmore's been asking after old company records again through back channels. Thought that particular door closed years back. Handle it the same way we handled her father if it comes to that. Crane knows what's required." The room went very quiet. Elizabeth looked up to find Nathaniel's face gone white and hard as stone, his hand curled into a fist against his knee. "He's had Crane watching us," Nathaniel said, his voice low and dangerous. "Watching this whole thing unfold long before he ever showed his face in my yard. The note he left after the fire, the debt he invented against the Hensleys, none of it was improvised. He's been planning his next move against us for months." "There's one more thing," Margaret said, and something in her voice made both of them look up sharply. "I found this folded separate from the rest, tucked into the back cover. I don't fully understand what it means, but I think it matters." She handed over a single loose page, and Elizabeth read it twice before the meaning settled fully into place, and when it did, she felt something colder than fear settle into her chest. It was a letter from a Richmond physician, dated the week of Josiah Abernathy's death. noting an unusually rapid decline, inconsistent with ordinary summer fever, and recommending a recommendation apparently never followed, buried instead in a grieving daughter's cabinet for 8 years, that the circumstances warranted further inquiry. "Your father may have been murdered," Nathaniel said quietly, and Margaret's face crumpled. 8 years of buried suspicion finally given confirming shape, and Elizabeth reached across the small table and took her hand, without thinking, the way one grieving daughter reaches for another. "I'm so sorry," Elizabeth said. "You've carried this alone a long time." "I think some part of me has known for years," Margaret said, her voice thick. "I think that's precisely why I never let myself look." Deputy. They stayed in Richmond only long enough to have the ledger and letters copied by a discreet clerk. Nathaniel knew and trusted a precaution against loss or theft on the road home. That Elizabeth understood with a chill was no longer merely theoretical caution, but plain necessity, and they left Margaret with promises of protection and support that Nathaniel made good on, immediately arranging for funds to be sent to her before they'd even departed the city. "You didn't have to do that," Elizabeth said, once they were back on the road heading home, the precious copied papers secured in a locked case at her feet. "She gave us the one thing that might finally end this. Least I can do is see she's not left to face whatever comes of it alone and penniless." He glanced at her. "Same as I told your father all those years back before I ever got the chance to prove it. A man doesn't leave the people who trust him standing exposed if there's anything at all he can do to prevent it." They rode through the second night, rather than stopping, both of them too keyed up with what they carried to consider rest, and it was somewhere past midnight, the road dark and empty around them, that Elizabeth heard it. The particular sound of hoofbeats moving too fast, too deliberate, closing from behind, rather than simply traveling the same road. "Nathaniel, I hear it." His voice had gone tight, and she watched him urge the horses faster, even as he reached beneath the carriage seat and drew out a pistol she hadn't known was there. "Get down low. Whatever happens, keep that case against your chest, and don't let go of it." The hoofbeats closed faster than the carriage could outrun them, and a voice rang out through the dark, rough and commanding. "Pull up, Whitmore. Got business with you and the lady both." Elizabeth's heart hammered as she recognized, even in the dark, even distorted by distance and the pounding of her own pulse, something in that voice that matched the name Margaret had spoken with such fear. "Crane," she breathed. "Stay down," Nathaniel said, and there was no softness left in his voice at all now, only the flat, dangerous readiness of a man who had spent years anticipating exactly this moment, and had run out of patience for waiting on it. A shot rang out, a warning aimed high, but close enough that Elizabeth felt the wind of it and screamed, despite herself, and Nathaniel didn't slow the carriage. If anything, he drove the horses harder, the whole carriage rocking dangerously on the rough night road, and Elizabeth clutched the case to her chest, exactly as instructed, and prayed with everything left in her that the wheels would hold. "There's a bend ahead," Nathaniel shouted over the wind and the pounding hooves. "Sharp one goes down toward the river crossing. I know this road better than any stranger chasing us in the dark ever could. Nathaniel, if he catches us." "He won't." He took the bend at a speed that should have overturned them, the carriage tilting hard enough that Elizabeth threw her weight against the low side to keep it from going over and behind them. She heard a second shot, wilder this time, and then a curse, and the sound of a horse stumbling on ground. It didn't know as well as Nathaniel knew it. They didn't slow again until the lights of a small crossroads settlement came into view ahead, a cluster of buildings with at least one window still lit, despite the hour. And only then did Nathaniel finally ease the horses back. Both of them breathing hard, the sound of pursuit fallen away entirely behind them. "Are you hurt?" His voice was rough with an adrenaline that hadn't yet finished draining out of him. No, I'm..." Elizabeth realized her hands were shaking uncontrollably. Now that the danger had passed, the case still clutched hard enough against her chest to leave marks. "I'm whole. Are you whole?" He pulled the horses to a full stop outside the lit building, some manner of coaching in by the look of it, and sat for a moment simply breathing, his hands still gripping the reins, though there was no longer any need to. "That's twice in as many days he's tried to stop us by force. Fire at my own home, and now armed men on an open road at midnight. He knows we've got something now, something real. He suspected before. Now after tonight he'll know for certain." Nathaniel turned to look at her fully, and something in his expression had gone grim and resolved all at once. "Which means the moment we're back on Whitmore land, this stops being a quiet fight, Elizabeth. There's no keeping this contained any longer, not after tonight. We take what we've got straight to the county publicly before he's got time to invent some new lie to bury it." They reached Whitmore land 2 days later, exhausted and travel-worn, but whole, and found the household relieved beyond words to see them, the fire's damage already being repaired under Mrs. Doyle's brisk supervision, extra hands hired on to watch the property through the nights that followed. But the peace of homecoming lasted less than a full day. It was Mrs. Doyle who brought the news, her face tight with the particular grimness of a messenger who knows her message will land like a blow. "There's talk in town," she said, finding them in the study where Nathaniel had spent the morning drafting a letter to the county magistrate, laying out everything Richmond had yielded. "Ugly talk. Blackwood's been busy while you were gone." "What kind of talk?" Elizabeth's stomach clenched. "He's telling anyone who'll listen that you two went off together unmarried, unchaperoned for 2 full nights and better, and that whatever business you claim took you to Richmond is nothing but a cover for—" Mrs. Doyle's mouth thinned with distaste at having to repeat it. "For an affair conducted under the pretense of investigating him. Says it proves exactly the kind of woman you are. Miss Carter, same as it always was whispered about your father, that scandal runs in a family same as blood does." Elizabeth felt the words land like a physical blow, worse somehow than any of Blackwood's earlier attacks, because this one didn't merely threaten her livelihood or her safety. This one aimed straight at the last thing she had left, her own name, her own dignity twisted into something ugly in front of an entire county. "That's a lie," she said, her voice shaking with fury she couldn't fully contain. A vicious, calculated lie meant to bury the truth under something more entertaining for people to gossip about. "I know that, child. So does anyone with sense." Mrs. Doyle's face had gone hard. "But lies travel faster than truth always have, and there's a county meeting called for Sunday next ostensibly to discuss the boundary dispute Blackwood raised with Mr. Whitmore weeks back, though I'll wager my own life savings that's not the true purpose of it now. He means to humiliate us publicly," Nathaniel said, his voice gone flat and cold. "Force the whole matter into the open on his own terms before we've had chance to bring our evidence to the magistrate properly." Elizabeth stood very still, feeling the full weight of what this meant settling over her, and something in her chest that had been building steadily since that first carriage ride. Hope, warmth. The beginnings of something she hadn't dared name yet began to curdle into a different kind of certainty entirely. "Nathaniel," she said slowly, "if I stand beside you at that meeting Sunday, if the whole county sees us together after this rumor's already taken root, you understand what it will cost you. Not merely your reputation, everything you've built here, every relationship you have left in this county, all of it tainted by association with a scandal that isn't even true. I don't care what it costs me. You should." Her voice cracked on the words, because saying them cost her more than she'd expected. "You've already paid your debt to my father, Nathaniel. You tried to testify for him, you carried his memory for 10 years. You took me in when the whole county turned me away, and none of that obligates you to burn down everything you've built, defending my honor against a lie a wicked man invented to protect himself. You owe me nothing further. That's not why I'd stand beside you Sunday." His voice had gone rough, and he crossed the room to stand directly in front of her, close enough that she had to tip her head back to hold his gaze. "I need you to hear this plain, Elizabeth, because I've spent 10 years not saying things plain, and I find I've run clean out of patience for my own silence. I did not bring you to this house because of a debt owed to your father. Nathaniel, let me finish." His hands came up, not quite touching her, hovering with a restraint that trembled slightly at its own edges. "I brought you here because on that road, with everything in the world already taken from you, you stood there and told me my offer had a price attached, even if I hadn't named it, and you were right to say so. And no other soul in 10 years has looked at me clear enough to see what I was really offering before I understood it myself. I have watched you these past weeks face down Dorothy Pemberton in her own store, run into smoke after a frightened boy sit across from a grieving stranger in Richmond, and coax the truth out of her with nothing but honesty and patience. You are the only person who has walked into my life in a decade and made me remember what it felt like to believe people could still be better than the worst thing that's happened to them. Elizabeth's breath had gone entirely unsteady. Her eyes burning with tears, she refused to let fall. If you say this in front of the whole county Sunday, I mean to say considerably more than this in front of the whole county Sunday. His jaw set with the particular resolve she'd come to recognize as immovable once it settled into place. I mean to lay out everything we found in Richmond, the ledger, the letters, Blackwood's own hand, admitting he knew your father was innocent from the very start. I mean to make it impossible for one more lie to stand between this county and the truth, whatever it costs me to say it plain in front of every soul who's ever whispered about either one of us. They'll destroy you for it. Blackwood has money enough, influence enough. Let him try. Something had ignited behind Nathaniel's eyes, 10 years of banked careful silence finally catching flame. I have spent a decade being the quiet man who lets his fences and his full granaries speak for him, because talking got twisted into something ugly once, and I decided never to risk it again. I am done being quiet, Elizabeth. I watched silence fail your father in that courtroom 10 years ago. I will not let it fail you now, whatever the cost. Elizabeth stood there in the study, the summer light slanting long through the window, the weight of everything they'd carried back from Richmond sitting heavy in the locked case, still resting on the desk between them. And she understood with a clarity that steadied, even as it terrified her that Sunday's meeting would not merely decide her father's name or Blackwood's guilt. It would decide everything. Then we go together, she said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. Sunday, in front of all of them. We tell the truth, all of it, and let the county decide for itself whether it's still capable of recognizing honesty when it's finally laid out plain in front of them. Together, Nathaniel agreed, and this time when his hand found hers, he did not let go. The 3 days before Sunday passed in a strange, taut quiet, the kind Elizabeth imagined soldiers must feel in the hours before a battle they'd already decided to fight. Nathaniel spent long hours in the study with the copied ledger and letters spread across his desk, cross-referencing dates, building the account he meant to lay before the county with the same careful precision Elizabeth's father had once brought to his own briefs. She helped where she could, her memory for numbers and dates sharpening the case further, but she found her mind circling again and again, back to the moment in the study when he had told her plainly what she was to him, and she had not yet found the courage to answer him with the same plainness. "You've gone quiet," he said late on the second night, looking up from the ledger to find her staring past him at nothing. "I keep thinking about Sunday, about what happens after whichever way it falls." She met his eyes. "If we win, if the truth comes out and Blackwood's finally made to answer for it, what becomes of us? Then a wealthy landowner and a woman still wearing a ruined name, even a cleared one. The gossip won't die simply because the accusation's proven false. Some of it will follow me the rest of my life regardless. Then it follows you standing beside a man who isn't ashamed to be seen with you," Nathaniel said without hesitation, "which is more than most women in your position are ever offered." "That's not an answer to what I asked." "No," he admitted, setting down his pen. "I suppose it isn't." He studied her a long moment, and something vulnerable moved across his face, the particular unguarded look of a man who had spent a decade protecting himself from exactly this kind of exposure. "I don't rightly know what becomes of us after Sunday, Elizabeth. I know what I want it to be. I haven't asked you yet what you want, because I didn't think it fair to ask a woman fighting for her father's name to also weigh a man's feelings in the same breath." "Ask me anyway." He came around the desk slowly and stood before her, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all, the lamp between them throwing long shadows across the room. "Elizabeth Carter," he said finally, his voice rough with something he wasn't bothering to hide anymore. "When this is finished, when your father's name is clean and Blackwood's answered for what he's done, I mean to ask you to stay on at Whitmore land, not as my housekeeper, but as my wife if you'll have me. I'm not asking it now because I'll not have you say yes to a man out of gratitude for a fight not yet won. But I wanted you to know it's coming. So Sunday, you're not fighting only for your father. You're fighting for whatever we might build after. Elizabeth's eyes filled despite every effort to hold them steady, and she reached up and pressed her palm against his jaw, feeling the rough stubble there, the tension held in the muscle beneath her hand. When Sunday's finished, she said, ask me. I think you already know what I'll say. Sunday arrived gray and close, the kind of heavy summer morning that promised a storm before evening. And the meeting house in town was already crowded by the time Nathaniel's carriage pulled up outside it, more crowded than Elizabeth had ever seen it. Because word of scandal traveled faster and drew larger audiences than any ordinary county business ever had. She felt every eye in the yard turn toward the carriage as Nathaniel handed her down. Felt the particular weight of 100 whispered conversations, pausing mid-sentence to watch them walk together up the meeting house steps, and she made herself walk with her chin level and her shoulders square, exactly as her father had taught her, because a carter did not enter a room looking as though she expected to be thrown out of it. Thomas Blackwood was already seated near the front when they entered, flanked by 2 men. Elizabeth didn't recognize his expression, composed into an easy, confident pleasantness that made her stomach turn with how practiced it looked. Whitmore. Blackwood's voice carried easily across the murmuring room as they took their seats. Miss Carter, I confess I wondered whether you'd have the nerve to show your faces here given the talk that's been going round about your little journey together. Talk you started, Blackwood. Nathaniel said low but caring, same as you've started every other piece of ugliness aimed at this family for the past 10 years. A ripple of murmurs moved through the crowd, and the county magistrate, a thin, tired-looking man named Judge Ainsworth, who Elizabeth remembered vaguely from her father's trial, seated then as a young clerk of the court, elevated now to preside, rapped his gavel for order. This meeting was called to address a boundary dispute. Ainsworth said, his voice carrying the particular weariness of a man who suspected already that the day's business would exceed its stated purpose. If there are other matters to be raised, I'll hear them in order, but I'll have this proceeding conducted with civility or not conducted at all. With respect, Your Honor, Blackwood said, rising smoothly. I believe the boundary matter can wait. There's a more pressing concern the county ought to address today, the propriety of Mr. Whitmore's household, and whether a man harboring a woman of Miss Carter's reputation under his roof, unchaperoned, ought to be trusted in matters of land and neighborly dealing at all. That's not a matter for this proceeding, Nathaniel said, rising in turn, his voice hard. Isn't it a man's character bears on every piece of business he conducts? Whitmore, same as it bore on Elias Carter's character 10 years past, when this very county found him wanting. Blackwood's eyes moved to Elizabeth with a coldness that made her skin crawl despite the pleasant mask he wore for the room. I only mean to protect this community from further scandal, same as I did then. Elizabeth felt the old fear rise in her chest, the same helpless fury she'd felt in Mrs. Pemberton's store, the sense of being spoken about, rather than to judged by a room that hadn't asked for her account of anything, and then beneath the fear, she felt something else rise to meet it, something sharper and colder, and entirely her father's. She stood. Your Honor, she said, and her voice to her own surprise came out steady and clear enough to carry to the back of the crowded room. If Mr. Blackwood means to make my character and my recent travels a matter of public discussion, then I ask the court's leave to address it directly, since I understand my own reputation and my own actions rather better than he does. A murmur moved through the crowd, surprise at a woman speaking so plainly in a public proceeding, and Judge Ainsworth studied her a moment before nodding slow and considering. You may speak, Miss Carter, provided you keep to relevant facts. Thank you, Your Honor. Elizabeth turned to face the room and found standing there with every eye in the county fixed on her that the fear she'd expected had gone strangely quiet, replaced by something that felt almost like relief, the relief of finally being permitted to speak the truth aloud after 4 months of swallowing it. Mr. Whitmore and I traveled to Richmond this past week unchaperoned. Yes, exactly as Mr. Blackwood says. We did not travel for the reasons he's suggested to half this county over the past several days. We traveled because we had reason to believe that evidence existed proving my father's innocence of the charges brought against him. 10 years ago, charges brought, Your Honor, by Thomas Blackwood himself. This is precisely the kind of wild accusation. Blackwood started, his composure slipping for the first time. I am not finished, Mr. Blackwood. Elizabeth's voice cut across his with a firmness that surprised even her. We found that evidence. We found it in the keeping of a woman named Margaret Abernathy, daughter of a Richmond clerk named Josiah Abernathy, who worked for the shipping company that carried your debts, Mr. Blackwood. In the very year my father was accused of theft, he never committed. The room had gone very quiet. Now the particular quiet of a crowd sensing that the day's business had suddenly become considerably more serious than a boundary dispute. Your Honor, Nathaniel said, rising to stand beside Elizabeth. I have in my possession a ledger in Josiah Abernathy's own hand documenting 11 months of debts Thomas Blackwood accumulated across 3 failed ventures. Debts totaling well beyond the $800 that went missing from this county's relief fund, the same year Elias Carter was accused of taking it. I have also in my possession letters written by Thomas Blackwood's own hand to an agent named Silas Crane, dated 3 weeks before Elias Carter's arrest, in which Mr. Blackwood states plainly that he knew Carter had discovered the discrepancy himself, and that suspicion would need to be redirected before, in his own words, the story is to hold. Blackwood's face had gone pale beneath its practiced pleasantness, and Elizabeth watched something calculating flicker behind his eyes as he searched for footing on ground that was rapidly shifting beneath him. Fabrications, he said, his voice sharper now, less controlled. Forgeries invented by a desperate woman and a man whose judgment has clearly been compromised by whatever's grown between them these past weeks. I'll not stand here and be accused on the word of letters no one in this room has verified. Then verify them, Your Honor, Nathaniel said, and crossed to the front of the room, laying the locked case on the table before the magistrate with a deliberate, controlled motion. Every page is here. The original documents remain in Richmond in the keeping of Margaret Abernathy, who will testify to their authenticity if the court requires it, and who can further attest that her own father died under circumstances a Richmond physician found suspicious enough to warrant inquiry, and inquiry never pursued, because the man who might have pursued it, Josiah Abernathy himself, was dead within 9 days of first taking ill, the same year he came forward with evidence against Thomas Blackwood. A gasp moved through the crowd at that, and Judge Ainsworth's expression had gone sharp and serious. All trace of weary tolerance burned away. You're suggesting murder, Mr. Whitmore. I'm suggesting, Your Honor, that this court examine the evidence before it and draw its own conclusions. Nathaniel's voice had gone hard as iron. I'm further prepared to testify that 3 nights past my own barn was set alight by an unknown party with a note left behind threatening further violence should I continue asking questions about Thomas Blackwood's financial history. I'm prepared to testify that on the road home from Richmond, Miss Carter and I were pursued and fired upon by a man I believe to be the same Silas Crane named in Blackwood's own letters, the same man who came to a family under my protection this past week, bearing a forged note of debt meant to intimidate them into silence. Why didn't he say it? The room had erupted into murmurs, now too loud for the judge's gavel to fully quiet, and Elizabeth watched Blackwood's careful composure crack entirely, his face flushing dark with a fury he could no longer fully contain. This is a conspiracy, he shouted, rising fully now, his 2 companions rising uncertainly beside him. A conspiracy between a bitter, ruined woman and a man whose judgment has been clouded by. He stopped himself visibly, some last thread of control reasserting itself. But the damage was already done, the mask fully fallen away in front of the entire county. Mr. Blackwood, Judge Ainsworth said, his voice gone cold and formal. You will sit down and hold your tongue, or I will have you removed from these proceedings. I intend to examine every page of this evidence personally, and I intend to send for Margaret Abernathy to testify under oath, and I intend further to have the county sheriff take a full statement regarding the fire at Whitmore Land and the assault upon the road, effective immediately. Your Honor, I must protest the manner in which— Sit down, Mr. Blackwood. Blackwood sat slowly, his face a rictus of barely contained fury, and Elizabeth felt Nathaniel's hand find hers beside her, gripping tight, and she gripped back just as hard, feeling the whole room's attention still fixed on them, but no longer feeling the old shame of it. For the first time in 10 years, the shame in that room belonged to someone else entirely. It was in the recess called, while the judge examined the documents more closely, that the day's fragile progress nearly came apart entirely. Elizabeth had stepped outside for air, the close heat of the crowded meeting house and the strain of the morning finally catching up with her all at once, and she stood on the steps trying to steady her breathing when a voice at her shoulder made every muscle in her body go rigid with sudden dread. "Miss Carter, a word if you'd be so kind." She turned to find one of Blackwood's companions standing close behind her, a thin, sharp-featured man she didn't recognize, his voice pitched low and pleasant in a way that didn't match the coldness in his eyes. "I don't believe we've been introduced," she said carefully, taking a half-step back. "No need for introductions. I've a message is all from a friend who thought you ought to hear it plain away from all those listening ears inside." The man's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Whatever's found today in that ledger, whatever gets said under oath, it changes nothing about what happens to a woman who keeps digging where she's been warned off digging. Fire's a patient thing, Miss Carter. So's a man on a lonely road at night. Today's a victory you'd do well not to celebrate too loud." Elizabeth's blood ran cold, but she made herself hold his gaze, made herself keep her voice level even as her heart hammered against her ribs. "Are you threatening me in broad daylight on the steps of a county meeting house with a judge and half the town not 30 feet away? I'm delivering a message, ma'am. What you do with it is your own business." "Elizabeth." Nathaniel's voice cracked across the steps like a whip, and Elizabeth watched the thin man's composure falter for the first time as Nathaniel crossed the distance between them in a handful of long strides. His face gone dark with a fury she hadn't seen from him, even at the height of the meeting inside. "Whatever you just said to her," Nathaniel said. His voice dropped low and dangerous. "You'll say again in front of me, or you'll get back inside and sit beside your master before I forget myself entirely. No need for threats, Mr. Whitmore. Simply passing pleasantries with the lady. Get inside." The man went unhurried, with a last look at Elizabeth that made her skin crawl, and Nathaniel turned to her immediately, his hands coming up to grip her shoulders, his eyes searching her face with an intensity that had nothing controlled left in it at all. "What did he say to you?" "A threat. Fire again or something on a lonely road. He meant to frighten me into silence before the judge finishes reading that ledger." Elizabeth found her voice shaking despite her best efforts to hold it steady. "Nathaniel, this isn't ending today, is it? Even if the judge believes every word, even if Blackwood's arrested this very afternoon men like Crane, men who work for him in the shadows, they don't simply vanish because their employer's been exposed." "No," Nathaniel admitted grimly. "They don't nod on their own, which is precisely why we need more than a magistrate's private examination of a ledger. We need this laid out in full public view testimony under oath warrants issued for both Blackwood and Crane before either of them has chance to flee or silence anyone further. Then we go back in and we push for exactly that." "Elizabeth." His hands tightened slightly on her shoulders. "I need you to understand what pushing for that publicly, right now, in front of this whole county might cost. If Blackwood feels cornered enough, desperate enough, there's no predicting what a man like that does next. I've watched him escalate from rumor to arson, to armed pursuit inside the space of a single week. I don't know what comes after that if we back him fully into a corner today. I know exactly what happens if we don't." Elizabeth met his eyes steadily, feeling the old fear settle into something harder, something that had carried her through 4 months of closed doors, and now finally had somewhere useful to go. "We let him walk out of that meeting house with nothing more than embarrassment, and he spends the next 10 years doing to some other family exactly what he did to mine, exactly what he's tried to do to the Hensleys, exactly what he did to Josiah Abernathy. I did not survive 4 months on Virginia's roads to sit quiet now at the one moment we finally have the power to end this." Something in Nathaniel's face shifted resolve settling over fear, and he nodded once, sharp and certain. Then we finish it, he said. All of it, today. They went back inside to find the meeting house in a state of barely contained uproar. Judge Ainsworth's face grim as he set down the last of the copied letters, and when he called the room back to order, his voice carried a gravity that silenced every murmur instantly. I have reviewed the documents presented by Mr. Whitmore and Miss Carter, he said, and while I am not prepared to render final judgment on matters that properly belong before a full court with sworn testimony, I will say plainly that what I have read here raises grave and serious questions about the conduct of the original proceedings against Elias Carter 10 years past, and grave and serious questions about the conduct of Thomas Blackwood since. Your Honor, this is entirely improper. Blackwood began rising again, but Ainsworth cut him off with a raised hand. I am further ordering that Silas Crane be brought before this court for questioning regarding the fire at Whitmore Land and the assault reported on the Richmond Road, and I am ordering that Thomas Blackwood surrender himself to the county sheriff's custody pending a full investigation into these matters, effective this moment. The room erupted gasps and murmurs, rising into a roar that the judge's gavel could barely contain, and Elizabeth watched Blackwood's face transform in real time from outrage to something closer to panic, his eyes darting toward the door as though calculating whether flight was still possible. You cannot simply... Blackwood started, but two men near the door, deputies summoned in advance by some quiet arrangement Elizabeth hadn't been aware of, were already moving toward him, and something in Blackwood's expression cracked entirely, the last of his composure, shattering into raw, cornered fury. You think this ends it? Blackwood snarled, his eyes finding Elizabeth's across the crowded room, and the venom in his voice made the whole room go still. You think a ledger and some old letters undo 10 years of careful work? I have friends in this county your father never had, girl. I have money enough to buy silence in places you can't imagine, and I promise you whatever happens to me today, that farm of Whitmore's won't stand another season untouched, and neither will you. That's enough, Judge Ainsworth said sharply. Mr. Blackwood, you will restrain yourself or be restrained. But Blackwood wasn't finished. He turned wild-eyed toward the deputies approaching him, and in one sudden, desperate motion, shoved past the nearest one and bolted for the side door, and the meeting house dissolved into full chaos. Shouts and the scrape of overturned chairs. Elizabeth's heart lurching into her throat as she watched him vanish through the doorway, with two deputies scrambling after him. He's running, she gasped. Let them handle it, Nathaniel said, gripping her arm, though she could see the same tension coiled through his own body, the same instinct to give chase warring with the plain sense that a crowded meeting house was no place to add further violence. They didn't have long to wait. Shouts came from outside, then the unmistakable sound of a scuffle, and within minutes, one of the deputies reappeared at the door, breathing hard, his hand firm on Blackwood's arm, as he marched the man back inside. Coat torn, dignity utterly gone, his face a mask of thwarted fury. Tried to reach his horse, Your Honor, the deputy reported. Didn't get far. Take him to the county jail, Ainsworth said, his voice flat with disgust. I'll hear formal charges filed within the week once Miss Abernathy's testimony can be secured and Mr. Crane located. They dragged Blackwood past where Elizabeth and Nathaniel stood, and as he passed, he twisted his head toward them. One last time, his voice pitched low enough that only they could hear it clearly amid the continuing uproar of the room. Crane's not so easily found as I am, he hissed. You've not seen the last of this, Whitmore. Neither has your father's precious daughter. Then he was gone, hauled out through the front doors into the gray afternoon, and the meeting house erupted into a fresh wave of noise. The whole county talking at once. Some faces turned toward Elizabeth, with something that looked astonishingly like shame. For 10 years of misplaced judgment. Others still uncertain, still calculating which way the county's opinion would finally settle. Mrs. Pruitt was among the first to reach them, her face alight with a fierce, vindicated satisfaction. I always said it didn't. I told anyone who'd listen all these years. Elias Carter was a good man, and now the whole county's finally got proof of it. Thank you, Mrs. Pruitt, Elizabeth managed, though her mind was still racing with Blackwood's parting threat, the plain promise that this was not in fact finished. Judge Ainsworth approached them himself once the worst of the crowd's noise had settled, his expression grave. "Miss Carter, Mr. Whitmore, I want you both to understand that what's been uncovered today will require considerable further process before any final justice is rendered. Miss Abernathy's testimony will need to be secured properly. This Crane fellow will need to be found and questioned. Elias Carter's name cannot be formally cleared by public sentiment alone. It requires a proper legal proceeding, however clear the evidence may now appear." "We understand, Your Honor," Nathaniel said. "We only ask that proceeding be swift and thorough." "It will be." Ainsworth's eyes moved to Elizabeth with something that looked almost like an apology. "I sat as a young clerk in this very room 10 years ago, Miss Carter, and watched your father convicted on evidence I now understand to have been deliberately deceitfully arranged. I did not have the standing then to question it. I have the standing now, and I intend to use every particle of it to see this matter through to a just conclusion, however long it takes." Elizabeth felt tears rise unexpected and overwhelming, and she found she couldn't speak past the tightness in her throat, so she simply nodded, and the judge, understanding, gave a small bow of his head and moved away to attend to the considerable business the day's events had suddenly created. They rode home as the promised storm finally broke, rain coming down in heavy gray sheets that matched somehow the exhausted, wrung-out feeling settling through Elizabeth's whole body. Triumph and terror tangled together in a way she didn't fully know how to hold. "He's still out there," she said once they were within sight of Whitmore land, the barn's scarred, half-repaired wall visible even through the rain as a stark reminder of exactly how real Blackwood's threats had already proven themselves. "Crane, wherever he's run to. Blackwood, as good as promised, he'd finish what he started. I know it." Nathaniel's jaw was tight, his eyes scanning the property, even as they approached some old instinct for danger fully awake now, and unlikely to rest anytime soon. "I've already sent word ahead for extra men to watch the house through the nights until Crane's found. I'll not have today's victory undone by carelessness." They pulled into the yard to find Mrs. Doyle waiting on the porch despite the rain, her face tight with an urgency that made Elizabeth's stomach drop before the woman had said a single word. "Ryder came not an hour past," Mrs. Doyle said, raising her voice over the storm. "Left this for you, Mr. Whitmore. Wouldn't say who sent him, only that it was urgent, same as before." Nathaniel took the letter with hands that had gone very still, and Elizabeth watched his face as he broke the seal and read. Watched the color drain slowly from his features as his eyes moved down the page. "What is it?" Her voice came out barely above the sound of the rain. He looked up at her, and something in his expression frightened her more than anything Blackwood had said or done that entire long day. "It's from Margaret," he said. "In Richmond." His hand holding the letter had begun to shake just slightly. "She writes that a man came to her door not 2 hours after we left the city. Description matches Crane exactly. She managed to hide before he forced his way inside, hid in a neighbor's cellar through the night, while he searched her house top to bottom." "Is she hurt?" "She's unharmed, thank God, hidden safe with the neighbor still." His voice had gone hoarse. "But he found the false panel in her cabinet, Elizabeth. He found it empty, and he understood exactly what that meant." Elizabeth's blood went cold, the full weight of it landing all at once. "He knows we already have everything. Every copy, every letter." "He knows," Nathaniel confirmed grimly, "and a man that desperate, that exposed with nothing left to lose, and a master already in county custody, there's no predicting what he does next, except that it won't be nothing." He folded the letter, with hands still not quite steady, his eyes lifting to meet hers, with a grimness that settled over the whole rain-soaked yard like a shadow. "We got Blackwood today, Elizabeth. But Crane's still loose, still armed, still working for a man cornered enough to have promised us both wouldn't see the last of this. Whatever peace today bought us, I don't believe it's going to last the night." Nathaniel didn't sleep that night, and neither did Elizabeth. They sat together in the study, with every lamp in the house lit against the dark. 2 extra hands posted at the barn, and 2 more walking the fence line, with lanterns and loaded rifles, and the rain kept coming down in sheets against the windows, as though the whole sky had decided to match the tension inside. "He won't come tonight," Nathaniel said, more to convince himself than her. "Not in this weather, not with the house watched. A man like Crane works in shadows, not storms." "You don't believe that any more than I do." He didn't answer, which was answer enough. It was past 2 in the morning when the first shout came from the direction of the north fence, sharp and sudden through the drumming rain, and Nathaniel was on his feet, before the second shout, finished pistol already in hand, and Elizabeth grabbed the lamp and followed him out into the storm, without stopping to think whether she should. "Stay behind me!" he shouted over the rain, and she did. Though every instinct screamed at her to run faster because ahead of them, she could see lantern lights swinging wildly, and 2 of the hands grappling with something in the mud, a third shape breaking free and sprinting toward the tree line. "There!" one of the hands bellowed. "He's running for the woods." Nathaniel was already moving, and Elizabeth's heart lurched into her throat as she watched him give chase into the dark and rain after a man who had already tried to kill him twice, and she ran after them both, the lamp swinging wild light across mud and fence rail and rain-slicked grass. The chase didn't last long. Whether it was the rain slowing the fleeing man's footing or Nathaniel's own furious-driven speed, Elizabeth arrived at the tree line to find Nathaniel had closed the distance, had the man down in the mud with a knee planted hard in his back and the pistol pressed to the base of his skull, and in the wild swinging light of the lantern, one of the hands had brought up behind her. Elizabeth finally saw the face of the man who'd haunted every threat against them for weeks, Silas Crane. Thin, sharp-featured rain plastering his hair flat against a face twisted with fury and fear in equal measure. "Don't," he was gasping. "Don't shoot, I'll talk. You'll talk plenty." Nathaniel set his voice a low, dangerous growl Elizabeth had never heard from him before. "Starting with why you set fire to a barn full of sleeping men, and why you fired a pistol at a woman on an open road, and why you forged papers to threaten a widow and her children out of their home." Blackwood. Crane spat into the mud. "It was all Blackwood, every bit of it, his orders. I only did what he paid me to do." "Where were you headed tonight, Crane? What was tonight's business?" Crane's whole body went rigid, and Elizabeth saw the answer in his silence, before he ever spoke. It saw it land in Nathaniel's face, a half-second later, as understanding hit him too. "He sent you to finish it," Nathaniel said, his voice gone flat and cold as the rain itself. "With Blackwood already in county custody, unable to reach any of us himself, he sent you to finish what the fire didn't." "I didn't have a choice." Crane's voice had cracked entirely now, all bravado gone. "Man like Blackwood, you don't refuse him and live comfortable after. He knows things about me, things that'd see me hang twice over if he ever chose to speak them. I've been his creature 10 years more, and there's no walking away from a debt like that clean." "Josiah Abernathy," Elizabeth said, stepping closer despite herself, the rain running cold down her collar. "Did you kill him?" The silence that followed was answer enough, and Elizabeth felt something in her chest go both colder and clearer at once. 10 years of suspicion finally given confirmed shape in the broken silence of a man face down in the mud. "It wasn't meant to kill him outright," Crane said, finally, his voice barely audible over the rain. "Something Blackwood gave me meant to make him sick enough to keep quiet, buy time to recover what he'd taken. Didn't mean for it to carry him off entire. That's God's truth, whatever else I've done." "That's for a court to weigh, not me," Nathaniel said, hauling the man up roughly by the collar. "Get him tied and under guard till morning. We'll have the sheriff out at first light, and this time there'll be no question of Blackwood's money buying anyone's silence, because Crane here is about to give a full confession. Aren't you, Crane, if you've any sense left of saving your own neck from the gallows?" Crane didn't answer, but he didn't fight either, and the hands led him away toward the barn's undamaged section, with rope enough to hold him till dawn, and Elizabeth stood in the drenching rain with Nathaniel beside her, both of them soaked through, and shaking not entirely from cold. "It's over," she said, disbelieving the words tasting strange in her mouth after so many weeks of bracing for the next blow. "Nathaniel, it's actually over." "Nearly," he said, and pulled her against him without another word, and she pressed her face into his soaked shirt and felt for the first time since a door had closed on her, 4 months before, something like safety settle fully into her bones. The sheriff arrived with the dawn sober-faced and grim once he'd heard the full account and Crane's confession, given under the plain threat of a hanging judge and the promise of leniency should he cooperate fully. Filled in every remaining gap in the story that had begun 10 years before, with a stolen relief fund, and ended at last in a rain-soaked scuffle at the edge of Whitmore's north fence. Blackwood had known Elizabeth's father was innocent from the moment he discovered the discrepancy himself, precisely as the letters had shown. He had orchestrated the accusation deliberately, using his standing in the county and Elias Carter's own honesty against him, because an honest man who reports a problem quickly makes an easy scapegoat for the very crime he uncovered. He had silenced Nathaniel's testimony through the old land dispute, paid handsomely to a juror's cousin to raise the objection at precisely the right moment. He had sent Crane to Richmond once he learned Josiah Abernathy possessed evidence of his debts, with instructions that had ended in a fever that wasn't entirely a fever. He had watched Elizabeth's family collapse into poverty and disgrace, and had felt by his own agent's account no more than the mild satisfaction of a threat successfully contained. And when Elizabeth had appeared again on his radar first, as a woman begging work along county roads, and then more dangerously, as a woman under Nathaniel Whitmore's protection, asking questions that hadn't stayed properly buried, he had returned to the same well-worn methods without hesitation. Intimidation. First, then fire, then violence, escalating each time his targets refused to break. "There'll need to be a full trial," the sheriff said once Crane had been taken into formal custody and the whole ugly account laid out plain in the gray morning light. "Blackwood's and Crane's both, though I expect Crane's testimony against his master will go some way toward shortening his own sentence given how thoroughly he's turned. And my father's name?" Elizabeth asked, her voice steadier than she felt, though her whole body was trembling with exhaustion and the particular disorientation of an ending arriving all at once after being fought for so long. "Judge Ainsworth's already drafting the petition to have Elias Carter's conviction formally vacated, Miss Carter, on the strength of the evidence presented, and Crane's confession both. I'd expect that matter settled inside a month, maybe less, given how plain the truth of it's laid out now." Elizabeth felt her knees go weak, and Nathaniel's arm came around her instantly steady and sure, and she let herself lean into it fully for the first time since that first carriage had stopped on the road 4 months of memory ago. "A month," she whispered. 10 years, and it comes clean in a month." "It should never have taken 10 years in the first place," Nathaniel said quietly. "That's not justice moving swift, Elizabeth. That's justice finally being permitted to move at all."
Chapter 7.
News of Blackwood's arrest and Crane's confession spread through the county, faster than any rumor Blackwood himself had ever spread, and the change in how Elizabeth was received in town over the following days left her almost as unsteady as the danger had. Mrs. Pemberton herself came out to Whitmore land inside the week, standing awkward and red-faced on the porch with a basket of preserves held out like an offering her earlier cruelty, apparently weighing on her, now that the whole county understood exactly what kind of man had profited from spreading it. "I said things I oughtn't have said, Miss Carter." She managed not quite meeting Elizabeth's eyes. "About your family. About your character. I let a wicked man's whispers do my thinking for me, same as half this county did, and I'm ashamed of it now that the truth's come plain." Elizabeth took the basket and found to her own surprise that she felt no satisfaction in the woman's discomfort, only a tired, weary grace that had more to do with exhaustion than forgiveness freely given. "Thank you for saying so, Mrs. Pemberton. I hope the next woman who comes to your counter with a name the county's whispered about finds you slower to judge." "She will," Mrs. Pemberton said, and there was enough genuine shame in her voice that Elizabeth believed her. Others came too in the days that followed. Families Elizabeth barely remembered, neighbors who'd looked away rather than face her on the road these past months, all of them arriving with some version of the same halting apology, the particular social choreography of a county reckoning all at once with how thoroughly it had failed a family it should have protected. Elizabeth received each of them with more patience than she'd expected to find in her self-understanding. Somewhere in the tired center of her chest, that a whole community learning to be better was worth more in the end than a whole community simply feeling guilty. But it was a smaller visit unannounced, and unlike the rest, that moved her most. She was in the kitchen garden cutting herbs for Mrs. Doyle's supper when she looked up to find young Hensley standing at the fence with his mother beside him, both of them dressed in what were clearly their best clothes. His mother's hands twisting nervously at her apron in a gesture Elizabeth recognized now as entirely her own habit as much as anyone's. "Mrs. Hensley, is something wrong?" "No, miss. Nothing wrong at all." The woman's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I only wanted to say it proper before too much time passed and I lost my nerve. You and Mr. Whitmore, you saved this family. Not only from Crane's false paper, though God knows that alone would have been enough to be grateful for the rest of my days. You saved us from a fear that's been sitting on this whole county for years. The fear of speaking plain against a man everyone knew was wicked, but nobody dared name for it. My boy's going to grow up in a county that isn't afraid anymore because of what you two did. I don't know how a person thanks somebody proper for a thing that size." Elizabeth set down her shears and crossed to the fence and took the woman's trembling hands in her own. "You don't need to thank me, Mrs. Hensley. Watching your son run into a burning barn to save frightened horses, that's the kind of courage this whole thing was fought for. I only hope he grows up knowing that kind of bravery matters more than any name attached to it, good or bad." Hensley, standing beside his mother, ducked his head with the particular embarrassed pride of a boy praised in front of his elders, and Elizabeth felt something warm and whole settle into her chest, the particular satisfaction of watching a fight's true purpose finally made visible in the people it had protected. It was nearly 3 weeks later, the formal petition for her father's exoneration filed, and moving through the county's slow legal machinery. Blackwood and Crane both awaiting trial in the county jail, that Elizabeth found herself standing once more at the edge of the same road, where Nathaniel's carriage had first stopped for her, though this time she stood there by choice rather than desperation, watching the late summer light go long and gold across fields that had somehow, without her quite noticing, the transition become something she thought of as home. Nathaniel found her there, as she'd somehow known he would, and came to stand beside her without a word, both of them looking out over land that had nearly cost them everything, and had in the end given back more than either of them had dared hope for. "You're thinking of that first day," he said. It wasn't a question. "I am. 11 doors closed against me before yours opened. I keep thinking how close I came to walking past this very spot, with no one stopping at all, how differently everything might have gone if you'd driven past without a second thought, same as every other carriage that passed me that day." "I nearly did drive past," he admitted quietly. "Told myself it wasn't my place, that a decade of silence and caution had earned me the right to keep minding my own business. Got a quarter mile past you before I turned the carriage around." "What changed your mind?" "I kept seeing your face. The particular way you held your chin up, even walking half-starved down an empty road with nowhere left to go. Reminded me so much of your father standing in that courtroom 10 years back, refusing to hang his head, even as the whole county condemned him on a lie." Nathaniel's voice had gone rough. "I told myself if I let that same stubborn courage walk past me twice, once when I failed to save the father, once when I failed to help the daughter, I'd not forgive myself the second failure, the way I'd somehow managed to survive the first." Elizabeth turned to face him fully, the gold evening light catching the lines of his face, the scar through his eyebrow, the particular steadiness that had carried them both through every danger of the past weeks. "Nathaniel Whitmore," she said, "you told me once in your study that when this was finished, you meant to ask me something. I believe I told you I already knew what my answer would be." Something kindled behind his eyes, and he reached into his coat with hands that trembled just slightly and drew out a small velvet box that he must have been carrying for days, waiting for precisely this moment to offer it. "Elizabeth Carter," he said, and dropped to one knee in the dust of the very road where he'd first stopped for her. "I have spent 10 years believing myself a man built for solitude, a man whose silence was penance enough for every failure he carried. You walked into my life on this very road and proved me wrong within a single conversation. I don't have fine words the way your father did, the way lawyers and gentlemen are trained to have. I have only this: I love you plain and complete, and I want to spend whatever years are left to me, making certain no door ever closes against you again, while I've breath left to prevent it. Will you marry me?" Elizabeth felt tears spill freely down her face, and she didn't try to stop them because for the first time in 10 years, they were tears that carried no grief at all, only a fullness too large to hold quietly. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Nathaniel. 1,000 times yes." He rose and pulled her into his arms, and the kiss that followed carried in it everything. Neither of them had found the words for. Across the past weeks, gratitude, terror, survived. Grief. Finally given somewhere to rest, and underneath all of it, steady and sure, the particular joy of two wounded people discovering they had, without quite meaning to, healed each other along the way. The trial, when it finally came in early autumn, was swift and thorough. Crane's confession and the Richmond evidence leaving Blackwood's lawyers precious little ground to fight on. He was convicted on charges of fraud, extortion, and conspiracy, with the matter of Josiah Abernathy's death referred for separate investigation that would in time add a further charge. Elizabeth did not live to see fully resolved, but trusted, with the particular faith her father had taught her, would eventually find its own justice. Elias Carter's conviction was formally vacated the same week, Judge Ainsworth reading the ruling aloud in a courtroom packed with the same county that had once condemned him. His voice heavy with an emotion he made no effort to hide. "Let the record show," Ainsworth said, "that Elias Carter, attorney of this county, was innocent of every charge brought against him, was a man of honest character and honest dealing, whose only failure was reporting a wrong. He discovered before the man responsible for that wrong could silence him first. This court extends its deepest regret to his surviving daughter, Elizabeth Carter, for a wrong that should never have been permitted to stand as long as it did." Elizabeth sat in the gallery with Nathaniel's hand gripped tight in hers, and when the ruling was read complete, she found she couldn't speak at all. The weight of 10 years finally fully lifted, leaving behind a lightness she'd forgotten was possible to feel. They were married in late autumn. The trees along Whitmore land turned golden red, the whole county turning out for a wedding that would have been unthinkable 4 months before, when the bride had walked those same roads, begging for bread, and the groom had been known only as the county's silent, solitary gentleman. Mrs. Doyle wept openly through the ceremony, muttering something about finally seeing this house filled with the laughter it had been missing for a decade. Mrs. Pruitt sat in the front row with an expression of fierce, vindicated satisfaction, as though the whole event were somehow her own personal triumph, which in its own way it partly was. Young Hensley stood at the edge of the gathering in a coat too big for him, grinning wide enough to split his face, and Margaret Abernathy had traveled from Richmond to stand as witness, her own long years of fear finally settling into something like peace, watching the fruit of her father's sacrifice bear its final hard-won harvest. When the vows were spoken, when Nathaniel Whitmore, a man who had spent 10 years believing silence was the only safe language left to him, stood before the whole county and spoke his promises plain and clear and unashamed. Elizabeth understood that this moment was not merely the end of a fight. It was the beginning of everything her father had once promised her a clean name could still purchase, if she only held on to it long enough to see the promise through. Years passed as years do, and Whitmore land became known throughout the county, not merely for its cattle and its tobacco, but for something else entirely, a reputation quietly earned and steadily maintained, as a place where honest trouble found honest help, where a family fallen on hard times could knock without fear of the door closing in their face. Elizabeth managed the estate's correspondence and accounts still, though now she managed them as mistress of the house rather than employee, and she took particular personal satisfaction in the small, quiet work of helping families the way her own family had once needed help and rarely received it. She taught Hensley his letters until he outgrew the need for teaching entirely and stood proud years later when he left for study in Richmond, the first in his family ever to do so, carrying with him a letter of recommendation written in Elizabeth's own careful hand. Nathaniel spoke more now than he once had, though he remained at his core a man who preferred his actions to carry the weight his words once couldn't, and Elizabeth loved him no less for it. understanding better than most that some men show their whole hearts not through eloquence, but through the steady daily proof of showing up. They had children of their own in time, a boy and then a girl, and Elizabeth told them as they grew old enough to understand it. The whole story of the summer their parents had found each other, not softened, not simplified, but told plain and true, because she had learned across the hardest 4 months of her life that the truth deserved better than being smoothed over for comfort's sake. Your grandfather, she would tell them, was the most honest man I ever knew, and honesty cost him everything for a while. But it was returned to him in the end tenfold, because the truth doesn't stay buried forever, not really. It only waits for someone brave enough to go looking for it. 10. Elizabeth stood many years later, an old woman now silver-haired and still straight-backed in the particular way her father had taught her, on the same porch where a housekeeper had once opened a door for a starving stranger with nowhere left to go. And she watched her grandchildren playing in the yard below, watched the fields roll gold toward a horizon that had once seemed on the worst day of her life, entirely closed to her. Nathaniel came to stand beside her, older now too, his hair gone fully gray, but his hand finding hers with the same steady certainty it had found on a rain-soaked road decades before. "Do you ever think of that first day?" he asked. "The doors that closed on you before mine ever opened." "Every year," she admitted. "Every year, on this same day, I think of every house that turned me away, every woman who wouldn't meet my eyes, every closed door that told me the world had already decided who I was, before I ever had the chance to prove otherwise." She looked at him, at the land that had become the whole shape of her life, at the family they had built from the wreckage of 2 ruined names finally cleared. "And every year I think how close I came to walking past this house with no one stopping at all." "But you didn't." "No," she said, and something in her voice carried the full, settled peace of a woman who had fought for everything she now held, and had never once, not for a single day, since taken it for granted. "I didn't. Because sometimes the smallest act of kindness, a carriage stopped on an empty road, a letter with 3 words written in a dead man's hand, a door opened when every other door in the world had already closed, is not the end of a person's story at all. It is only the very beginning of everything worth living for."